All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky. This is Sam, and we are your hosts for tonight's exciting program on the historical atom. It is a privilege to have Ben Kissling here to discuss this topic. We are going to be comprehensively analyzing William Lane Craig's book and arguments for theistic evolutionism. Ben has studied this topic extensively. He's also written a must-read article on the topic, which can be found on the Creation Ministries website, and it's also linked in the description box of this video. I'm going to hand it over to Sam, my award-winning co-host here, to give our guest, Ben, an introduction.
All right. Thanks, Donny. So I am looking forward to dismantling this theistic evolutionism. So Ben Kissling grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and currently resides in Dallas, Texas. He has a BS in biochemistry from the University of Nebraska and is currently enrolled in the MA in Science and Religion program at Biola University. He has worked in many different laboratories, also as a youth pastor and a high school teacher. But origin science is his lifelong passion, and we're glad to have you here, Ben.
Glad to be here.
Appreciate that. Ben, thanks for giving us your time for tonight's program. And if there's anything else you'd like to add in terms of introduction, feel free to do so. And how are you doing tonight, brother?
I'm doing good. This is an interesting topic that I've spent close to 5 years studying. So I will add one thing is I have, since that bio was written on Creation Ministries International's website, I moved back to my native Lincoln, Nebraska. So I'm happy to be back home, and go Huskers.
Well, I'm sure they're happy to have you back as well, brother. Like you said, and I said earlier, you've studied this topic extensively. And so what we like to do on this channel is leave no stone unturned on these topics. And so you're definitely the guy to go to on engaging theistic evolution, but specifically William Lane Craig's book here on the historical atom. And so, Ben, in order to set the foundation for what we are going to be discussing tonight, and because we're focusing heavily on William Lane Craig, he is a popular Christian apologist. He does a fantastic job defending the Christian worldview. I mean, he does a great job in debates against atheists and naturalists. But unfortunately, his view on the age of the earth and ancestry is incorrect. And so can you speak briefly about his book, his newer book, In Quest of the Historical Atom? And for anybody unfamiliar with his newer book on the topic, what's it about and what does he argue for in it?
Okay, so this book came out almost exactly 3 years ago, and it's called In Quest of the Historical Atom. And in this book, Craig is making an argument in favor of something that we agree with, that Adam and Eve were historical, individual people, and they were the first human beings and the sole progenitors of all humanity. So we agree on all of that. He specifically started this book and his earlier book on atonement theory because he's writing his systematic theology now, and he felt that those two areas were weak for him. And so he admirably wanted to study issues that he's not so well versed in. And this book was one of those. And in general, he believes that Adam and Eve were members of a species called Homo heidelbergensis that lived about 700,000 or more years ago. And so that's somewhat of a unique view for an old Earth creationist. As you probably know, and your audience probably knows, people like Hugh Ross argue for between 50 and 200,000 years ago for the origin of humanity. So Craig's view is that it is much older, when human beings, what he would consider to be rational, sentient image bearers, meaning bearers of the image of God, began about 700 or more thousand years ago. And he brings to bear a lot of archaeological and scientific evidence that he thinks shows that human beings were actually rational and image bearers before the typical old Earth view. So, whereas we would say as young Earth creationists, all those human fossils were post-flood and all of them are human. So in that sense, Craig's actually coming alongside young Earthers and agreeing with us, even though our position was always this for biblical reasons. But he's basically saying, no, we've got all kinds of evidence of technology, writing and stuff that shows that these really ancient humans, according to the old Earth dating paradigm, are actually real humans and not just apes that are on their way to being human, right? So he believes in a very sharp distinction between humans and apes, which is also good. So that's his main thesis in the book.
It's very interesting that he would argue for Homo heidelbergensis as being representative of Adam and Eve, if I understood what you're saying. And so according to the conventional model of origins in evolutionary theory, as you said, Homo heidelbergensis would be dated back at 700 to 750,000 years. And so that means all of your other hominins. I guess my question would be, does he view your other hominins like more controversial ones? Let's say Homo erectus or Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, right? Naledi, I think they date around 300 to 350,000 years ago. Neanderthal, of course. So he would actually consider all of those being human?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Now, so he wants a literal Adam and Eve as the first humans. Is that explain to me how that works when we understand that it's populations that evolve. How do you have these two people out of that population have a mutation that somehow designates them as humans within that population? How does he get a literal Adam and Eve?
Well, that part is a little unclear, but in the book, at least, he argues that there's a very specific point mutation that is involved in brain development in humans that he thinks God directly caused. At least that's what he argues in the book. His views have changed a little bit over time, but that's what he says in the book. And oddly, he thinks that is caused by God, but all the previous evolution that includes way more complicated stuff and difficult to believe that just happened, that all happened naturally, and that's fine. Like, he's very concerned about not interfering with the evolutionary paradigm, right? So I don't want to say anything that the scientists will disagree with, right? But he's saying, well, maybe there's this one little point mutation in brain development that God caused, and we can say that means that God caused this and brought Adam and Eve into existence out of this, like you say, this population of hominins. Now, one interesting feature of Craig's view on this is that he is actually very unclear about whether he thinks that Adam and Eve actually interbred with this population. Mm-hmm. So his initial inclination seems to be that he doesn't want to say that Adam and Eve interbred with them, which on his view would be bestiality,
yes.
Breeding with animals. So he doesn't want to say that, but he has this problem of how do you explain how Adam and Eve came from a previously existing population and just started inbreeding with each other and their children, and we're not deformed or anything, right? So at certain points, he seems to allow that, well, maybe they inbred a little bit. Like, it's not very clear, So
you'd still need.
He uses this as an argument against Swamitdas's view, which is different. Like, Swamidas thinks they were just all inbreeding. Like, Swamidas even thinks that Adam and Eve could have been created de novo rather than coming from the population. He just thinks they interbred all the time. And so he uses this as an argument against Swamitdas's view. But then when he's questioned on it, he kind of says, well, maybe they interbred a little bit, because if they don't, it causes problems for his model.
So obviously this is an issue, the bestiality issue when it comes to other models that aren't young Earth creation, like the old Earth creation model, specifically at our reasons to believe. And so, as you put it, we clearly interbred with hominids like Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps, because we have Neanderthal genes today. So obviously we were having children with them. And so how does William Lane Craig's model differ from other non-young Earth creation models like reasons to believe? Because it seems like on that issue, he does have a stronger position, at least on the issue of hominin interbreeding.
Yeah, so Neanderthals would come way after Adam and Eve on Craig's view, whereas not so much on the reasons to the RTB model or reasons to believe model. So I'm not clear, but RTB says that Neanderthals were not human. Is that correct?
Right. They view most of those hominins, if not all of them, I think, as being animals.
Yeah, and so Craig brings a lot of evidence in the book to bear, showing that he thinks Neanderthals, made tools, buried their dead, did art and things like that, to show that he thinks they're real humans. So yeah, that would be a huge difference with the RTB model. And he has a lot of differences with RTB model, especially on biblical interpretation too. So,
and a commenter here, and I would disagree. He says inbreeding is more of a problem for young Earth creationists. Well, here's the thing: as young Earth creationists, we can group all of your so-called hominins like Neanderthals, like Erectus, Heidelbergensis, so on. It's Denisovans, of course, the ones that we actually have genetics for, which would be Denisovans and Neanderthals. We can group them into the same kind because the basic definition of species, the biological definition of species, is if we can interbreed, we're the same species. And so that's not an issue for creationists. And then we have good explanations for, obviously, the morphological differences in hominins like Neanderthals. Ben, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so the inbreeding argument was actually brought up by a secular scientist named Leslie Hlusko when Craig presented his book at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting in 2021, I believe, which was right after the book came out. And Hlusko gave the argument that inbreeding is a problem because it causes deformations in morphology and all kinds of nasty stuff. And so the reason why this isn't a problem for the young Earth view is because young Earthers would say that Adam and Eve were created with a perfect genome, meaning they have no mistakes in their genes. And the problem with inbreeding is that it's the mistakes in the genes that don't get corrected when you never interbreed with other lineages, right? So each lineage can form this kind of mutually self-correcting effect in sexual reproducing species that tends to help prevent certain mutations from accumulating and spreading in the whole population. But if there's no mistakes in the genome, if the genome is perfect, inbreeding would not cause that to occur until mistakes start to accumulate in the genomes. And once mistakes started accumulating in the early humans on the young Earth model, they were already a large enough population to avoid that. So inbreeding does not present that same kind of problem for our view.
Right. You nailed it. Inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. Adam and Eve, right at creation, wouldn't have any genetic mistakes, so there wouldn't be any inbreeding problem. So you nailed it there, Ben. So my next question to you, excuse me, is based off of William Lane Craig's theology. So he has issues scientifically, obviously, with evolution. We'll touch on that a bit later. But what I'd like to ask you, because William Lane Craig, he argues that Genesis 1-11 contains enough family resemblances, and you talk about this in your article, to ancient Near Eastern ideological myths to classify it as such. So firstly, Ben, what is etiology? And is there any legitimacy to William Lane Craig's argument here?
Yeah, so etiology is just a big fancy term for a type of story that grounds present realities in the distant past. Now, with something as an etiology, it doesn't say necessarily whether it's true or false or whether those past events actually occurred. So I think young Earth creationists can be perfectly in agreement that Genesis is an etiology, because we say that Genesis is the story of how things came to be as they are now because of these stories because of these happenings in the distant past. So we can agree that Genesis is an etiology. But what Craig wants to do, and he does this extensively in the book, is he compares it to other etiological myths of other ancient tribal societies. And so he's trying to build this sort of feeling in his audience's mind that these etiological myths of ancient peoples are really crazy and weird and can't be taken seriously, and then compare that to Genesis and say this is an etiology just like that. So he tells these really interesting stories. Actually, this is one of the best parts of the book, at least for me. These interesting stories about a raven in like northern Siberian tribe somewhere that created the world and human beings through various bodily functions. There's another story about a really interesting story that he uses a lot about some Pacific Islander myth about a temple that they had. And when they were visited in the age of, actually, I think it was during like the Enlightenment period, like 1700s, by Westerners on a ship, they came to this island, they met these natives, and they heard their myth about how they built their temple. And the natives, in the meantime, were looking at this wondrous ship made with iron nails, which they didn't have, right? And they said, oh, wow, why? Because their myth said that their god gave them the materials for this temple, right? And told them how to build it and everything, but he didn't give them iron nails. So somebody comes back some later time and finds that this myth has changed, and now it includes a story about why their god didn't include iron nails. And it's sort of like a punishment for not doing what he told them to do or something, you know. So this myth like changed over time, right? And Craig's argument here is hard to apply to Genesis because Genesis, as far as we can tell, has not changed over time. So he claims that he talks about how myths are identified, these etiological myths are kind of identified as being changeable. And there's two kinds of change. One is called plasticity, which means there's multiple different versions of the myth at the same time. And the other one's called flexibility, which means that the same myth can change over time, which is kind of what this Pacific Islander myth did. And so he says, well, these are what myths are in the ancient world, but he never makes the argument that Genesis fits that description. And this is his main argument for why myths aren't historical, or that you can tell they aren't historical, because the ancient people just played fast and loose with them. They changed them all the time. Right. You know, they had different versions of it. And so they must not have believed it was true, right? Well, what's the case with Genesis? Did the ancient Jews change it all the time? Did they have different versions of it? No. And that point is just kind of left in the book unremarked upon. It's like he doesn't notice that he made this whole long argument. I mean, this is a massive portion of the first part of the book. And then he's just basically says, well, like Genesis, we don't have any other versions of it. So these criteria don't apply to Genesis.
Yeah, that would be a categorical error, because as a Christian, we believe that the scripture is God's inspired word. So even to compare that to other, myths or historical documents that are not God's inspired word, that would be a categorical error.
Yeah, and I mean, his whole purpose here is to rescue inerrancy, the doctrine of inerrancy. And he states that in the preface. He's like, I think we shouldn't give up on inerrancy. And so he wants to say Genesis is inerrant. But he also wants to say that the history that's in the book is etiological, which I think it clearly is. I mean, if you read it, even if you don't believe it's true, it's clearly etiological. I mean, it's talking about the origin of snakes, the origin of all created animals, the origin of male and female, the origin of sin and why there's evil in the world. The origin, if you go later, the origin of human government is in Genesis 9, with God's telling Noah, like, if man sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. The rainbow as a symbol of the world won't be destroyed. I mean, there's all this etiological themes in here about why things are the way they are. And yet Craig wants to deny that it's historical. So my big argument is, how can you say all three of these things are true? Namely, inerrancy, there's no errors in the text in what it means to teach. And two, it's etiological, which means it's grounding present realities in the distant past. And three, it's not actually historical. How do you hold all three of those at once?
Yeah. How do you say that it's inerrant, and just to turn around and label it mythologically historical? I don't understand that.
So as young earthers, we deny that it's not historical. So we deny one of those three, and we take the other two. We say this is an etiological story that tells us how things came to be.
Right.
And it's also inerrant. A theistic evolutionist would typically deny inerrancy. And so they would say it's etiological and not historical, but, it's not true, or it's not completely true, or something like that. And Craig, I don't think, realized that this was a problem for his view, honestly. So
it's interesting because William Lane Craig, from my understanding, and you mentioned it earlier, he would hold to some aspects of Genesis 1-11 as being real history, right? Like Adam. So he does believe some of the passages in the New Testament where Paul and Jesus refer to Adam as obviously a real historical character. But then most of the other portions of it he believes is myth. And so I'm wondering, does he make any attempt in a sophisticated manner to say, okay, here's where the author is conveying something that we need to take as true and real, and here's somewhere else where the author is giving us a clue or many clues where we as the reader should say, okay, this being described here, this is not literal history, this is just mytho-history? Does he make any attempt at that, Ben?
Hardly at all. In fact, what he says is it's probably, quote, probably futile to try and tell the difference between what's, not real or not real history and what's true. And in fact, about the only argument he gives for the historicity of the actual text of Genesis 1-11 is the genealogies. And he says of the genealogies that they show that the author had a, quote, historical interest. Well, he obviously doesn't believe the genealogies are true or historically accurate. So what does a historical interest mean? And if the genealogies are the one thing that he can't accept, he can accept Adam and Eve, he can accept a moment of creation, right? Or, I mean, there's lots of other stuff he doesn't accept, but that's the one piece of evidence he gives for the historical interest of the author. And it's like, okay, so is the author saying that this is what he thinks history is? And if it's inerrant, how can he be wrong about that? I mean, and the thing you said about the New Testament is the main reason Craig believes in a historical Adam is because he thinks you cannot read certain passages in Paul any other way, namely Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. And so he says you can't actually take seriously here that what Paul was saying unless you say Adam and Eve really existed.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, I think he's right about that.
Yeah.
But the weird thing is, why do you think Paul believed Adam and Eve existed?
Right.
Yeah,
And Jesus.
because it's in the Bible. And so Craig rejects the idea that we can believe that Adam and Eve are historical from Genesis, but believes it from Paul, who was depending on Genesis. And Craig even makes arguments showing that Paul was quoting from Genesis chapter 2 in 1 Corinthians 15. So Paul is obviously referring back to Genesis. But he can't, like, he never brings himself to say that we can believe Adam and Eve in Genesis are historical, because the only places they're mentioned are in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then 5, all of which he has to deny the historicity of.
So what are his thoughts then of Jesus referring to
Yeah.
the beginning of creation, like creation week? In the beginning of creation, he created the male and female, and he's making an application to marriage and divorce. And so clearly referring to Adam and Eve during creation week, the beginning of creation. Would he recognize that as being Adam and Eve, but then not referring to what we see in Genesis 1 and 2? Or how does he view that?
So the short answer would be no. He thinks he doesn't believe that's a historical reference.
Okay.
And the reason is he's trying to say that Jesus and the other New Testament authors could have been making what he calls an illustrative allusion or an illustrative reference, where they were only referring to the story to make some kind of point, like in a parable. So when Jesus says, what is the quote, like the way it was from the beginning, male and female or something, he would probably say, I haven't heard him speak to this specific verse, or I don't remember, but he would probably say that Jesus was making an illustrative reference, that he was referring to the story to make a point about marriage, but he wasn't technically affirming the historicity of the story he was referring to. Right. So that requires what he calls an assertoric reference. I'm not even sure if that's a word. I should look it up and find out. But meaning that there's certain references like Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, yeah, this is actually asserting the historicity of Adam and Eve. Whereas a reference like what you brought up is probably just an illustrative reference, meaning it's not directly claiming that it's history. So that's kind of his view of a lot of texts that we would argue are in the New Testament that show the historicity of Genesis.
It's interesting, the things that he's saying and arguing. It makes me wonder, has anyone else in the history of the church written these kinds of things, made these types of observations and points? Because when you just read what Jesus says and understand what he says, it doesn't seem to be saying what William Lane Craig is saying about it. So if what he's saying about it is true, you'd think you'd find other people making that same argument over the last couple thousand years, Ben.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few examples of people like Oregon, especially, who believed all the way up to Genesis 3 was some kind of fable or myth. But they're kind of few and far between. Augustine had issues with Genesis chapter 1, but both of those people I can show definitively were young earth creationists because of Genesis 5 and the genealogies. So clearly they did not believe in, kind of the Hugh Ross scenario where the days of creation were long periods of time. They also did not believe, like what Craig's argument is that Genesis 1 through 11 is mytho-history, right? They clearly did not believe that. And so they believed Noah's flood and all that stuff. Tower of Babel is included in there. Augustine, I believe in the fall. So, there's lots of evidence that the ancient Christians were young earthers, and there is zero evidence. And I say that, knowing that that's a universal negative. That's hard to prove, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I have been asking old earthers for years and years and years, when they make claims about what ancient Christians believed on the age of the earth, to give me a reference. Give me a reference. Show me where they say that. And every single time I have looked it up myself, it does not say what they claim it says. So Augustine and Origen were both clearly young earthers. They said so in arguments that they both made against pagan views that the earth was older. And they said, these guys are wrong because we have the history in the Bible. It's right there. And these pagans are wrong. And Origen, who was the most liberal of any of the ancient Christians that I've seen, in that he goes up to the story of the fall in Genesis 3 and says that didn't happen. Even Origen says, when talking about the age issue, the age of the earth, he says that this pagan Celsus that he was criticizing, the only reason he's doing this is because he's trying to cast discredit on the Bible and Christianity. And what that tells me is that the issue was not controversial in Origen's time. He's like 2nd century AD. So if there were all kinds of other Christians who believed in an old earth, why did Origen feel so confident in stating that this pagan only objected to the biblical timeline because he was trying to discredit the Bible? Why didn't Origen mention, oh, and there's these other Christians, right, who believe in an old earth?
Right.
There's no examples of this. And there's lots of different claims that have been made about different quotes. Some are taken out of context. Some are kind of wishy-washy, but don't say what they claim is said. There's a really good example of this in Irenaeus and another ancient author where they're talking about eschatology. They're not even talking about the creation week. And so that what they say is that, well, there were 6 days of creation, and that's sort of like a prediction or a prophecy of the length of the world that's going to happen. And so they thought that Christ would come at year 6,000, like the second coming. And they believed that the first coming was around year 5,500 because they were going by the Septuagint timeline back then. And so they thought in 500 years or less, the second coming is going to happen. And then the 7th day is representative of this 1,000-year millennial kingdom after the second coming. And so, but the quotes are that the old earthers will take out of context is something like, they'll say like the 6 days are 6,000 years. I think Irenaeus says that. And so they say, look, it's the day age theory. Irenaeus believes that the days of creation are 1,000 years long. No, it's not what he was saying at all.
Right.
He was saying that the days of creation were a prophecy of the future history of the world, not that the days of creation themselves were 1,000 years long. And people like Hugh Ross take this out of context and claim that this supports the age theory. I go on and on about some of this, but we have tons of evidence when the ancient Christians spoke on the age of the earth, they follow the biblical timeline and they say it is young. We have no evidence of anyone in the ancient world who was an old earther. None. Up until at least the 1700s, we don't have any examples of Christians who did that.
And I think you made a good point, and then Sam will hand it to you, and I appreciate how comprehensive that was, because you do see many in the old earth camp attempt to make arguments that within church history, there were old earthers or people, like you said, day age theory. But even within your main lineage of churches, you don't find any writings against other Christians outside of the main lineage of churches that believed in old earth creation. You don't see any kind of debate, because you do see that with other doctrines.
Yeah, you even see it with the flat earth stuff, which is also somewhat nonsense. But there's actual examples of ancient Christians who believed in a flat earth.
That's interesting. Even
though it was not even close to the mainstream view. But you will see zero examples of an old earth view. And that's why this kind of torques me off, because old earthers say this all the time and there's no evidence for it.
Yeah, you could look to like a lot of the anti-Trinitarian positions if you were to get into the world of theology. They didn't largely exist within the main lineage of churches, but you do see those church fathers, like Irenaeus, I think, who's writing against Christians outside or people outside of the main church. And he's pointing out, yeah, they believe in this and this is wrong and this is how you refute it. But you don't see any of that with theistic evolution or old earth creation. It just did not exist for all that time.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
And the reason it's a problem for their view is because they want to claim that they're just interpreting the text. right? We have this text of Genesis. I'm just looking at the text and in reading it, and it seems to say that the earth is old and evolution is okay and all this stuff. But before modern science came along and told them that that was true, nobody interpreted the text that way.
Right.
Because it's not in there.
Yeah. So it's not the natural reading.
No.
Which is it, or else other people would have. The Holy Spirit is working in the body of Christ. So obviously, the Holy Spirit would have guided at least one person into that truth. And so, okay, but I think those are some excellent points. Sam, if you had a question you wanted to ask or bounce anything off of Ben, go ahead.
Yeah. So moving on, how does he tackle the flood, the global flood? Is that a global flood? Is that a local flood? What would that look like?
So Craig does not believe that the flood happened. So he doesn't address an actual historical flood at all. In fact, when I spoke to Craig in the class on the book that he gave, he said, this is ridiculous. There's no such thing as a worldwide flood that killed everybody. He thinks that's ludicrous. And he thinks it's against all the evidence and all this stuff. But when it comes to his biblical interpretation, because he believes that Genesis 1 through 11 is mytho-historical, he can interpret the flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 9 pretty straightforwardly. In fact, very similar to what we would interpret it as. And in the book, he takes Hugh Ross to task on this. And he says, look, this was in the text, it was a global flood that was being talked about. And Hugh Ross is just wrong about all this. It's obviously a global flood. You can't argue otherwise. So that section of the book's actually pretty good. But he thinks it's mythical. So for him, it's just this fake story that didn't happen that means something else. Who knows what, I mean, the only thing he ever says about the flood is that it shows God's justice and God's mercy because he judged the people who were doing bad things and he was merciful to Noah and his family. So for Craig, that's nothing more than a parable about the justice and mercy of God.
Yeah, it seems that when the creature takes the creator's word, draws a line of a demarcation in there and says anything on one side of this line is mythological, anything on the other side of this line would be maybe arguably literal, but then condemn the unbelievers for just moving that line to the end of the book. That seems really inconsistent. And when I hear Craig talk, he likes to use the word fantastical. He says that, well, I don't believe these things in the book because they're fantastical claims. And Donny and I, it's funny. He sent me a message earlier, and we were thinking the exact same thing. When you have the creator of heaven and earth coming down into his creation and making us right with him, wretched sinners, that's a fantastical claim. And so would a virgin birth and a resurrection. Those are all fantastical claims. That a God could love us and make us right with him while we were yet sinners in the world. And that's true for the unbeliever. And that's a fantastical claim. And so it just seems it seems arbitrary what he defines as a fantastical claim. And it's also not an argument. It's incredulity, right? But it's not an argument. And I personally enjoy listening to Will Craig's philosophical arguments. He's definitely brilliant. But on this area, it's hard for me to comprehend why he doesn't see that as a problem. That's not an argument. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I've been studying this so long, I kind of forget all the stuff that hit me right away. But that was one of the things that hit me right away when I was looking at his view was this is an argument from personal incredulity.
Yeah.
That I just think that these things are so weird that they must be mythical. They must not have really happened. And it's like, well, what do you do with the entire rest of the Bible? So there's like, and it's like, how do you decide that? And I will take issue with one thing you said, Sam. you said he defines this as fantastical. He never defines what he means by fantastic.
Okay, correct.
The only description other than that word he gives is palpably false. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, and he's an analytical philosopher. He's supposed to have really precise meanings of words.
Yeah. And he should be aware that he's making a very similar argument that certain atheistic philosophers have made against miracles.
Right.
And Norman Geisler, in his big book of apologetics, he's refuted all of those things too. So he's actually, and I don't want to say unwittingly, I don't want to use a deflationary term. I know he's got to know that these things have been discussed. And he's got to know that they've been addressed. And so when he says that there are these claims that are fantastical in the Bible that he can't comprehend, is he just agreeing with the atheists who would reject any divine intervention into the physical world?
Well, obviously not. 'Cause he doesn't believe. He believes he believes God intervenes and does miracles. Obviously, he defends this, but the question is why? I mean, how can you argue for miracles scientifically?
Right.
Can't really. How can you argue for it philosophically? Well, you can argue for its plausibility, but not the actual occurrence of it. You have to argue for miracles based on the historical accuracy of the accounts in the Bible. And when he goes after Genesis 1 through 11, suddenly he gets cold feet about that.
Yeah. It's
And
inconsistent.
and I think it's because he just can't tear himself away from the scientific claims that he thinks he must be true.
Right. If I could, he would need, because you said it there, he doesn't define what he means by fantastical or fantastic. So then where do we draw the line? What's fantastic? Too fantastic where it can't be true, literal history, and what isn't at that point where it's now too fantastical, basically, like the resurrection, Sam, as you pointed out, the virgin birth, or just read the book of Revelation. I understand much of it is symbolic, but much of it is describing real events, hail and fire cast upon the earth, worldwide destruction in many ways. Okay, that we read in Revelation. Is that too fantastical? So yeah, I think you nailed it, Ben, that he is arguing largely from personal incredulity.
I'm not the only one who said that, by the way. I think I did put this into the article, but in 2019, which is before the book was written, much less before it came out, he did almost an entire year of Sunday school classes that he has up on his YouTube channel. It's called Defenders 3. This is like a 7-year program or something. But this year in 2019, he did this specific issue. He calls it the Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity. And in that class, a friendly questioner mentioned the fact that his argument about fantastical events and being palpably false might sound like an argument from personal incredulity. And he was raising this as a devil's advocate, right? Like, I want to see how Craig responds to this.
Right.
And you know what Craig actually said? He said, well, some things are just incredible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, an atheist would say the resurrection is incredible.
It's like back to it's like back to what Sam said, is like he recognizes these are bad arguments in every other context. Why is he so confident in using them in this context?
Right.
Well, you had mentioned that, and I think
I don't know.
I think it's fascinating because you mentioned, Ben, earlier that he would look to the account in Genesis 6 of the flood, and he would agree that it's obviously describing a worldwide flood. Okay. And he's not satisfied with arguments from people like Hugh Ross and those in the old earth camp. But he is so anti-young earth creation because William Lane Craig has said, and it's not word for word, but he said something like, if young earth creation is true, we're in trouble. Christians are in trouble. So if he thought that the local flooders were making a good point on Genesis 6 and the rest of scriptures that mention the flood, then he would probably go along with it because that would help him out. But even he's recognizing, so I think this helps the young earth creation model. He's even recognizing that Genesis 6 is clearly describing a worldwide flood.
Yeah. And that means he can't make Hugh Ross's argument about 2 Peter 3,
Right.
which is the verse that I think is the strongest young earth argument from the New Testament, which talks about the flood, right? So Ross says, well, this was just a flood that covered the world, right, where people lived. But if Craig doesn't think that this is a local flood in Genesis, he can't make the argument that this is a local flood in 2 Peter 3. So
yeah, 2 Peter 3 is such a powerful verse. I mean, it describes the creation. It describes the world that then was being overflowed with water that perished, and then the coming judgment by fire. So so it sounds like William Lane Craig doesn't believe the creation story as it's described in Genesis 1 and 2. And he doesn't believe that there is a world, pre-flood world, that was overflowed with water, Genesis flood. But then I'm assuming he would believe the third event that people deny, the coming judgment by fire. So how come that one's true? Why is that real history in the future, but then the other two aren't?
yeah, I made this argument directly to him in the class, and he said something like, the best I can do is that the weight of evidence is on my side, right? So he didn't really have a response to that in the class. I think he's tried to make some responses to it later in some of his public stuff, of course, without ever mentioning me or anything. But in terms of where I lost my train of thought. But yeah, so the 2 Peter 3. So part of Craig's argument that Adam and Eve really existed historically is based on an argument by a New Testament commentator named Douglas Moo. And Moo argues that, similarly to what you just said, that if Paul is referring to Adam as being the originator of sin in Romans 5, it would be crazy wouldn't make sense to say that Jesus had to come and save us from our sin, which entered the world through Adam, right? If Adam didn't actually exist and actually sin first and cause that to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So he's saying that the argument that Paul makes no sense if Adam is not historical.
Right.
And I argue that the same reasoning applies to the 2 Peter 3 verse, that it makes no sense for Peter to say, well, there are people who say that things just keep going on as they've always gone on. But I tell you that in the past, there was this worldwide flood that killed everybody, And so that proves that it doesn't always keep on going on as it always has. And then he uses that as evidence that there can be a second coming, right? But how does that work if you think that the worldwide flood didn't actually happen? It would, and I made this illustration to Craig, like it would be like if someone said, the aliens are coming, they're going to invade in the future. And someone objects and says, no, they're not. That's not going to happen. Things will keep going on as they've always been going on. And then that person would respond, well, yes, they have. Didn't you see Independence Day?
Right.
Why would that argument wouldn't track? Because Independence Day is not real.
Yeah, exactly. Like this flood is supposedly myth. It's not real. It's too fantastic.
So Peter is making a really terrible argument, like, oh, well, there's this fake story that happened, and that proves that you're wrong about something in the real world. No.
I take issue when Craig says that things like the evidence is on his side, because he, of all people, ought to know that evidence is interpreted through a worldview. And so you don't interpret the interpretable facts, until you have a worldview philosophy. And so all he's saying there is that there's a prevailing paradigm, and it's a naturalistic worldview, and he is affirming the naturalistic interpretation of the physical world. But that's not the biblical worldview interpretation. So I don't know why he thinks that that's such a powerful argument for him, or response for him to make. The unbelievers, they have no other option. If they're going to disallow the divine foot in the door, then of course they're not going to interpret the physical world through the biblical lens. And so I don't know that he's really responding, at least within the Christian circle, by saying something that the evidence is on his side.
Yeah, I mean, Craig is a classical apologist and an evidentialist, not a precept. So I'm not sure what he thinks about what you just said. But I agree at least that what even counts as evidence depends on your worldview. It depends on what framework you're coming from. Evidence is an interpretation itself of facts and observational data. So when you say something's evidence, that you're putting it into an argument, right? And right away, that means it has semantic meaning, right? Like direct observations don't really have semantic meaning. You have to give it to them. So I don't know how he would respond to that. He didn't really talk much about his theory of evidence and epistemology in the book too much.
Well, he does numerous times. He commits a reification fallacy when he says that the evidence speaks for itself. The evidence says, well, that's a personification of something.
Oh.
If the evidence did in fact speak, then it would say that the Bible is true. See, the evidence doesn't speak. It's the scientists speaks. They interpret the evidence around them through their philosophical leaning, which would be naturalism. In William Lane Craig's case, you would think that he would at least know what that is, but or maybe he does. I don't know. He's very interesting. He's sometimes he's hard for me to listen. I love listening to him, but not on this topic. It's frustrating,
especially when he gets into the science. And so, based on what you're saying, Sam, and then Ben, I'd be curious to your thoughts. It seems like William Lane Craig is looking to scientific consensus to determine, maybe he doesn't want to admit it, to determine what is and what isn't fantastic or incredible. So, for example, the worldwide flood, he agrees that Genesis 6 is describing a worldwide flood in 2 Peter 3, but it's too incredible. There's no way there was a flood. There's no evidence, but according to who? Like, it seems like he's going with the scientific consensus, and because of that, they would argue that there was no global flood. There's no evidence for it. And because of that, he determines that Genesis 6 must therefore be myth, not real.
Yeah, I mean, he's never really interacted much with creation science and the nitty-gritty details of where we would give evidence for that and all that. Like, he doesn't know anything about that. I got to be careful here because I keep wanting to kind of psychoanalyze him and figure out, like, where is this coming from?
Right.
Like,
if he's never said it, then we can't really.
But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that Craig has very sophisticated philosophical views that include things like, for example, he's a metaphysical anti-realist of some kind. I forget his an exact. He goes real deep into this, right? Where he thinks that abstract objects don't really exist and all this kind of stuff, but when it comes to science, all of a sudden it's just like, well, whatever the scientists say, I'm just gonna be like, okay, that's awesome. You go, science, And he doesn't have any sophisticated philosophy of science. Like, well, I can't say that either because he does. Like, he says he's an anti-realist. He said that in the class with me. So I think he holds to.
Have you had personal interactions and discussions with him? It sounds like you did.
Yeah, so he did a class on the book about a month after it came out in 2021, and is like this week-long seminar at Houston Baptist University, which is now called Houston Christian University. And anyone could audit the class by paying a fee, and you'd show up, and it was like 2 hours where he would do a lecture and take questions. And then there was a half hour at the end where he would leave and the students would talk. It was really fun. It was 5 days in a week. And so, yeah, I took this class and I made a podcast of all the questions I asked him, like recordings of the questions. So he does adhere to some kind of anti-realism for, I think, some scientific theories. I'm not really sure which ones, but I think he doesn't believe in general relativity, right? So I think he would say that general relativity is does not correspond to reality. So the correspondence theory of truth. So he takes an instrumentalist or anti-realist view of general relativity, but he does so for philosophical reasons. And so he has a sophisticated understanding of the options available, the philosophical options available on how you can view science. But I've met other people like this. It's like all of the sudden, when it's about the age of the Earth, all that flies out the window for some reason, and they just take this dogmatic straight line view that you can't disagree with the scientists on this, or you're stupid or crazy or the Bible's false or whatever. It's like, why
Or
can't
we're
you
in trouble.
yeah, like what where's the motivation to defend the accuracy and historical reliability of the Bible in Genesis? And he defends it with the resurrection of Christ very vigorously in the
Right.
Gospels.
And he does it. He does an excellent job defending the
Yeah, I mean, that's how
resurrection.
he kind of started out in this whole thing, was defending
Yeah.
the historicity of Jesus and the
He'd make a
resurrection.
great young Earth creationist.
Which is
He
a
would.
fantastic claim, by the way. and one which the prevailing scientific paradigm would reject. And I would see that as a bit of an inconsistency there, because on one hand, you can't point to that scientific consensus when it benefits you, almost arbitrarily, and then when it comes to something that you do believe, abandon that consensus. Is it going to be your authority consistently, or is the Word of God going to be your authority consistently? And I think that's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, so since all that happened, I've studied a view by a colleague of, or at least a friend of Craig's, named J.P. Moreland, who
Yeah.
defends a view called eclectic realism, where he says, well, if we have some reason to doubt the veracity of some scientific theory, we can interpret it as anti-realist, but not all of them. So some of them he thinks are true and real, some theories, and others he has objections to. And he mentions there could be philosophical objections to this theory or theological objections to this theory, right? And so we would just say, well, that's an instrumentalist theory because we have reasons to doubt it from other disciplines, right? Like philosophy and theology. What is the problem? Like, with saying we want to hold to the Bible and the straightforward, perspicuous interpretation of it, or simple interpretation, and say that, well, okay, if there's some scientific claim that is opposed to that, why can't we just say we have a reason to doubt it? I really, this part, I'm with you, Sam. I really don't get it. Like, I really don't get why they think we're so crazy when they do the same thing themselves all the time. And I can give tons of more examples of this in Craig's own positions. So
it could be, and I might be misspeaking, but it could be, when someone like Bertrand Russell, for example, atheist philosopher, they'll say that he destroys both the object and the subject of knowledge. And Phil would be, or Dr. Craig would be, familiar with his work. And maybe that's why he would point to that anti-realistic position. However, there's another philosophy that we would call like a revelatory epistemology, where the mind of God is the first interpreter of all the facts. And all the facts would be secured by the mind of God, and then we would go on to say, I might be misspeaking again because I haven't heard Craig unpack this, but it seems like that would just destroy truth at some point, unless you're receiving that truth from the mind of the Creator. From a creaturely perspective, I don't know that I would disagree, but again, I should probably not say anything else until I hear him out more. But on Christianity, we have the creator-creature distinction. And so the mind of the Creator secures and is the first renderer of all the facts around us. And so it would be true that, yeah, we can't know a thing objectively, I would say, unless that thing was revealed by the Creator. It
I mean,
gets
I think that's the best way of knowing something. It's the most certain way of knowing something.
that's right.
So,
That's right. And we would go on to say, well, that would really be the only way you could truly know something, or else you're going to be pointing to some brute fact or some provisional conclusion that you could be wrong about, which would be the prevailing paradigm, scientific paradigm. Those are provisional conclusions.
I think what Craig would say to some of that is that you can never have certain knowledge. In fact, I think, which I actually would agree to, somewhat. He said something like certainty is a will o' the wisp in one of his questions of the week. I think that was in.
Is he certain about that? Right.
Well, I really don't know much about Craig's epistemology, honestly.
Yeah.
So.
Well, if I could interject this, because there's some good discussion going on in the live chat. And so Cool Jesus here holds the theistic evolution position. I appreciate the engagement and interaction. If there's any other theistic evolutionists in the chat and you want Ben to specifically engage something, and more specifically in William Lane Craig's book on the historical atom, feel free to send those in. We'll engage them. Cool Jesus says William Lane Craig defines fantastic elements on page 104. So we pulled up page 104, and it looks like it supports what you said. Craig says, I take it that fantastic elements, which, if taken literally, are so extraordinary as to be palpably false. But what's his idea of so extraordinary? It sounds arbitrary. If he's going to say the Genesis flood is too extraordinary to be true, well, then what about events in the end times? Which I understand you gave some reasoning on behalf of him earlier. But anyways, Ben, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I said that's the only way he defines fantastic is palpably false. And that's a phrase that he used in the class also before the book. And so there was a point in the class, again, where someone asked a question about the talking donkey, the story with Balaam, because Craig was saying the talking snake in Genesis 3 is a fantastic element that he doesn't believe it's true because it's a talking animal. And so the point was made that there's this story, I believe, is in Numbers about a talking donkey. And does Craig believe that? And what ends up happening when you ask him these things is he'll start, and he did this with me in another question about the second commandment, is he'll start making distinctions about, well, this is different in Numbers. The talking donkey is different because, and it's kind of obvious he's just kind of making it up. The talking donkey is different because I can't even remember what he said, but he gave some excuse in the class for why that story is different than the talking snake in Genesis 3, and he does this with like the cherubim story. There's a complicated whole thing about argument that he makes about the second commandment, which says don't make graven images of anything, on any creatures on the earth below or the heavens above, and he says, well, that was a restriction against making images of real animals. And so the argument, which he takes from a Jewish scholar named Sarna, so it doesn't apply to the cherubim that were carved on the lid of the ark, on top of the Ark of the Covenant, right? So they're cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And so obviously, and God orders them to do that. So the argument is that the second commandment does not prohibit images of fake or not real animals or creatures like cherubim. And then he makes the argument that the cherubim that God places at the Garden of Eden to prevent Adam and Eve from going back in, with the flaming sword and everything, they're cherubim also. And this argument about the second commandment means that cherubim aren't real creatures. So therefore, the story is not real. And so I brought up the objection to this of another story, I think is in Numbers, about the bronze snake that God tells Abraham or Moses to make, so that because the the Israelites had committed some sin and they were being bitten by venomous snakes as a punishment. And they plead for mercy, and God tells Moses to make this bronze snake and erect it in the middle of the camp. And this snake is in, it's in some logo that we have for medicine nowadays, as
Blue
you see it
Cross.
around, right? What?
I think it's the Blue Cross symbol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's this, obvious exception to this rule. Like, why does God order them to make a bronze snake if the second commandment prohibits making images or sculptures of real creatures? And again, Craig's response to this was, it's like he'd never considered it before, and I went back and listened to the podcast again today, and I'm just like, he never even thought of this objection before he researched it and put it in the book, because he can't answer that objection. He just can't answer it. He fumbles all around. He gets the second commandment wrong, and I actually had to read the text to him to remind him of what it says. And because he's trying to make the claim that, well, the second commandment is not about earthly creatures when it explicitly says that. So, the obvious meaning of the second commandment is that you're not supposed to make idols, right, to worship. And if the second commandment does not apply to fantastic or unreal creatures, then probably 90% of the ancient idols would not have been prohibited by the second commandment. So it's this really convoluted argument that makes no sense. And the whole thing is just invented to say that the cherubim are not real, and therefore the story of the cherubim in Genesis 3 is a mythical story. It's not real. And it makes no sense with the rest of the Bible. So
I think that's a great...
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think that's a great response. When you have to have such convoluted responses to defend your specific viewpoint, as William Lane Craig is doing, it kind of speaks to the weakness of it, in my opinion. And I get we're going to have longer, more detailed answers to certain questions, but these are pretty pertinent issues that you're bringing up, Ben. And here's a follow-up question. I'm curious as to your thoughts. So he says, does Ben not see any difference between Genesis 1 to 11 and the rest of Genesis? It's standard for commentators to separate the sections. What are your thoughts on that, Ben?
It might be standard for commentators to do that, but the author of Genesis did not do that. In fact, Craig in the book says that the transition from the end of chapter 11 to the beginning of chapter 12 is seamless. That's a quote. That's the word he used. Seamless. And it's seamless because the people talked about in the genealogy in chapter 11 are the same people in Genesis 12 through 50. And there's lots of them mentioned. Abram's father and grandfather are mentioned. They're given ages for when they died and when they had sons. I think even some of Abram's other relatives were mentioned, like Bilhah or something, Makkah, I can't remember. But and then later on in Genesis, it gives really long ages for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph's 110. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lived to be way older than anybody lives today. I think the claim that there is some kind of division between chapter 11 of Genesis and chapter 12 is one of the weakest parts of his argument. And there's a lot of weak parts. It's like, which one do I choose? But I made the point in the written article that if you were just basically an alien, you come down and you have in front of you the text of Genesis chapter 11 and the text of Genesis chapter 12, and you just read them both. I think, looking objectively just at the text, you would immediately assume that chapter 11 is history and chapter 12 is more likely to be mythical, because chapter 11 is just a bunch of, here's this person, he lived this long and had this son, and then he died, and all this. And then chapter 12, it starts out with this it says God spoke to Abraham, this sort of, this patriarchal ancient God spoke to Abraham and gave him a promise that you will possess the land. It's like that seems a whole lot more mythical than chapter 11. And it just seems like this division is really arbitrary. You can't, I don't think you can say that a division happens in the text right there, because again, it gives the genealogy of Abraham all the way down to Abraham, and then it starts into Abraham's life. And people in the genealogy are mentioned throughout Genesis 12 through 50 as real people. I don't see how you make a division there. And it's not in the original text. Commentators might do it, but that's sort of like sort of like saying that chapter divisions, which were put in by modern interpreters or more modern interpreters, have some meaning as to what the text means. Like, so you're trying to make an argument that, well, because Paul ended chapter 4 of Romans at such and such, that means something about the beginning of chapter 5. Well, no, it doesn't. Paul didn't make those chapter divisions.
Right.
We did.
Yeah, right.
For reference's sake, right?
No, I think those are some great points. And then Apologetics 101 here, I appreciate the comment. He says the literary style is the same in the genealogies in Genesis 25 is the same style as the others in Genesis 5, 10, and 11. And so I think you made a great point, Ben, that it's arbitrary in terms of where you're going to divide it. Okay, you're going to divide it right at Genesis 11, but you made a great point that Genesis 12 seems like it would be more along the lines of what William Lane Craig is saying in terms of mythos history, I guess, than Genesis 11. So why break it there? Who's making these decisions, and what's the justification to do so?
Yeah. And if we know this as young earthers, but you look at the genealogies, right? And there's this steady or exponential decline in ages, right? It goes 900s and for the antediluvians, and then 600, 400, 200. Where do those stop being real ages?
Yeah.
Does it stop with Abraham? Because it says Abraham lived to be 175. Does it stop with Isaac? Isaac was 185. What about Jacob? Jacob was 147. And then it says Joseph was 110. Are we just going to say, well, because we don't know of anyone who lives to be as old as Jacob was, that, well, it must be that Jacob was the fake one and Joseph was the real one, but Jacob is spoken of way late in Genesis. Another issue with the dividing Genesis between 11 and 12 is that Craig actually makes the point that the commentators divide Genesis into 3 parts. There's another division later in Genesis, but he never says that this division changes the genre of the book, right? So his claim is that Genesis 1 through 11 is in this special genre of mytho-history, and Genesis 12 through 50 is not, right? But if the only argument is this commentator's division, well, another one occurs in Genesis. So why is there no genre switch there, but there is between 11 and 12? He never answers that question. It's almost like he doesn't even notice that that's something that needs to be addressed. It's like these things just came up all the time. I was like, why does he think this is such a good argument when stuff that he says, I didn't even know that Genesis was divided into 3 sections. He's the one who said that in his book. I'm like, well, why is there a change in genre here, but not over here?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, this is a recipe for denying the historicity of all of Genesis.
Right. Have you heard of this other theistic evolution argument? William Lane Craig doesn't make it, as far as I understand. But Inspiring Philosophy, you mentioned the ages. And so he's asked in his video, Problems with Young Earth Creation, he says, why was Abraham called, which you're more than familiar with, why was Abraham called an old man if his ancestors were living hundreds of years old? Basically, well, Abraham's not old then, because in comparison, 500 years is a lot older. 900 years is a lot older. I'm wondering, have you heard that? And what are your thoughts on that argument?
I have heard that. Yeah, it's like Abraham knew he was old because his contemporaries
Right.
were
Yeah.
old at that age, right? Like
It was
his
no longer
father
the
and
norm that
grandfather.
people were living to 300, 400, 500 years old.
Yeah,
It was the exception.
yeah, his father and grandfather were around 200 something, right?
Mhm.
So he knew he was getting old, according to that. Like, I don't know.
And he could also see around him in that time that ages were declining. People were no longer living to those great ages. So things were clearly changing. And Abraham recognized that. So, yeah, his contemporaries, rather than what we saw in the pre-flood world, in the immediate post-flood world. So I think that's a pretty lousy argument to attack the literal ages. Ben, I think you would agree. And so I'd like to rewind a bit. I'd like to backtrack to one of the first questions I asked you. I want to better understand what William Lane Craig's arguing here. So, etiology. You defined that, you explained it, you touched on it. So basically, William Lane Craig, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's looking at traits and characteristics of stories we'd all agree are myth from other religions, civilizations, largely pagan, a lot of them. And he's saying, okay, so those characteristics and traits match up to what we read in Genesis, specifically the creation account, Genesis 1 to 11 in general. And so because of those commonalities, Genesis, at least the chapters in question, must also be myth. Is that basically what he's concluding?
Yeah, so he is back to the family resemblances argument. So he makes this argument that you can't really find necessary and sufficient conditions to determine that the genre of a text is what he calls mythohistory, which I even think that he equivocates on the meaning of mythohistory as a genre anyway. Like, we don't need to get into that, but so he gives these 10 criteria that he thinks are family resemblances to myths. And I don't remember the first 6 because they're super trivial. It's like, it's a written text. Okay. There's lots of those. That doesn't really distinguish between what's historical and not historical, if it's the written text. And he said some of them are like they're passed down for a long time, or things like that. The key ones are the last 4 in his list, and 2 of them he admits does not apply to Genesis at all. And the other 2, one of them is the fantastic or palpably false criteria,
right?
And the other one is etiology. So he says Genesis fits 8 of the 10 for being a myth, and so I'm going to classify its genre as a myth. And it's like, it doesn't really say whether it's historical or not. So you could argue for a definition of myth that is historical, right? So a myth could just be a formative story, right? That people believe. If on that definition of myth, we could agree to that, right? But most people, when they hear the term myth, they think false,
Right.
And I think Craig doesn't accept that definition, and he gives a lot of references to scholars, folklorists, professional academic folklorists on this, and he says there's a difference between myths and legends, right? And he gives a good description of all of this. But the key issue is, did the people who wrote this and read it and listened to it way back then, when the text was first written, did they believe that it was true? Okay. And if you're talking about other cultures' myths, you can say, yeah, they believed it was true. They were just wrong. Okay. So if you look at the Bible and say, yeah, they believed it was true, but you can't say that it was wrong, or you're denying inspiration and inerrancy. Okay. So if this comparison that he makes is kind of like, is he really saying that the myth, his version of the myth, means it's not true or not historical? Again, he's a little wishy-washy on that. He doesn't really explain, like, what is myth and what is historical. Is he making the argument that because it's classified as mythohistory, that means we can just say whatever it is, it's not historical? Because as I said before, all the arguments that he used that might apply to whether it's historical or not don't apply to Genesis, the plasticity and flexibility thing. And I just think you've got to rule out those first 6 criteria. They don't really speak to historicity. And I think the fantastic thing is a argument from personal incredulity, and etiology is true, but it doesn't argue against historicity. So there's nothing in that argument that he makes about family resemblances that I find compelling at all.
Does he try to unpack what it's there for?
Barely.
They're all there. I mean, what do these things mean? If it's all mythological, why is it there?
If he's holding that it's an etiology, he thinks that it's a story that the ancient people told to explain to each other how things came to be the way they are. That's what an etiological myth is. But again, we already talked about this. Like, why would it be true then if it didn't actually happen?
Right.
But at the end, I think he kind of switches arguments without telling you. At the end, he has no interpretation of the text, and he will say this when he talks about the book. He says I'm offering a genre analysis, is how he phrases it, not a hermeneutic, not an interpretation, because he doesn't offer either of those things. He's just saying this is a genre analysis. That's the first step to a hermeneutic, but not the last one. You gotta have an alternative interpretation of the text, and the only thing that he ever does on that regard is he gives 10 theological lessons from the text that are like about the character of God. Like, God is just and merciful. We talked about that. And he gives several other points. There's a total of 10. I guess he likes the number 10. So, he gives 10 theological lessons from the text. Well, he never argued that this text is a theological text. He argued that it's etiological. And in fact, in the book, he gives arguments against a typical theistic evolutionist interpretation that says Genesis is a theological polemic, meaning the purpose of the story is theological, to make theological points against pagan religions. And he argues against this view. But then when it comes to his own interpretation, he gives a theological interpretation. The whole book, he was arguing that it's an etiology. Etiology and theology are not the same things.
Yeah, would it make the revelation there dishonest if it's still a divinely inspired word, but it's not accurate in any way other than to refute a certain group of pagans? How would that look? I don't know. I've not really thought that through at all.
To play devil's advocate a little bit, someone who took the theological polemic view would say that it's sort of like a parable, like Jesus told a parable, and we don't believe that parables actually occurred, right?
Okay.
He was telling the story to illustrate some theological point, and that's what they would say about it. They would say this is a story that the ancient Jews told to illustrate a point about the one true God that they worshipped and how he is as against these ancient these other pagan gods, right? And the key point here is that the cornerstone of this kind of interpretation is making these textual comparisons between Genesis and other ancient religious myths, creation myths, to say that the text, this story in Genesis is specifically critiquing this specific story element in this other creation myth. And so they're trying to draw connections between the texts to say that this is a response to this other text. And Craig makes an argument, which I think is correct, that he calls it parallelomania. It's finding parallels in texts that are just, you make it up because you're looking for them, right? They're not really there. And I agree with that, right? That's a good argument against Genesis being a theological polemic, that you can't make this argument that Genesis 1 through 11 depends on other texts or references other texts. it's very sketchy and very thin. And there's a whole body of literature on that. Then when it comes time for him to interpret what the text means, it's all these theological ideas about God. So I just don't understand.
So it sounds to me like, and I could be wrong, but it sounds to me like William Lane Craig, he's not really explaining in detail what he believes about Genesis 1. I'd like to ask questions like, why are there 6 days? What does it mean? What's its significance? How do we read? How should we read it? How do you justify why we should read it that way? Is he going into incredible detail on answering those, which I would believe, important questions?
No, not at all. Almost all of what he says is, God is the creator in general, right? He doesn't go into any specific interpretation of the text, and all he ever says is it's probably futile to figure out what all this means. So, and I just read into that. I have to. I don't know any other way to interpret this. Is he just went in there. All he was trying to do was cast doubt on the idea that it's a historical text and is trying to tell the truth about history so that he can remove these intellectual chains that are binding us to the Bible, and
then we just apparently we got to throw out there for all of our really good exegetical breakdowns and commentaries on Genesis 1, because he wants to just say, well, it just shows that God's creator, and that's it. Nothing more to see here, folks. Move on.
Yeah, he doesn't have any interpretation of any of the interesting parts about the text. It's just very general. God's just and merciful. Humankind are sinners, and we have offended God. And
it seems like God put a lot of details. Yeah, it seems like it looks like God put a lot of details. The author of Genesis 1-11 put a lot of details for us to just conclude what you just said, based on William Lane Craig, that he's the creator and sin is bad and all of these details. Cool Jesus is wondering, Ben, what is the purpose of Genesis 1-2? What did the Holy Spirit intend Moses to teach Israel?
I mean, I think that if you're God and you created this whole world for people that you love and created the world for them and wanted to establish a relationship with them, why would you not tell them the story of how you did it? And you're talking to them already. You're talking to Moses, right? On the Mount Sinai. You're establishing your people and revealing yourself to them. I think he was just telling us the story of how it all happened. Here's your place in the world. Here's how I made you. This is the kind of God I am. I made you. I mean, that's God's key claim to being our authority, right? Is that he made us, and he's telling us this is how I did it. Why would you not want to tell people that? The history of the world, here it is. That's interesting in and of itself. I'm sure he was intending it to be read theologically in some sense, but I mean, what is a better way to reveal yourself to human beings than to tell them the truth about what you have done?
Right. And the thing is, with all scripture, there's always an interpretation and an application. And sometimes there's 2, 3, 4, 5 applications. So God's word is so deep that, we can have an interpretation there with some more significant meanings theologically and applications as well. But that doesn't take away from the intended meaning historically and interpretive wise of Genesis 1-2, that it's literally telling us how God created the earth, how God created the universe, the first man, the first woman. That doesn't take away from these truths and realities.
Yeah, and I think it has today consequences in our culture today for denying that.
Yeah,
because we have no other way to say that there's some authority that made us male and female. That's an issue today. We have no other, people say, well, science tells us that there's male and female. Well, actually, and I actually was taught this as an undergraduate at a secular university by my philosophy of science teacher. She did a whole unit on all these diseases that cause gender abnormalities, because her point is that in the real world, scientifically, there are exceptions to the gender binary. So if your only argument to gender against for a gender binary is scientific, you're probably going to lose that argument. And we may disagree on this, but I think, like, why do we believe in the gender binary? It's because our Creator made us male and female, and Genesis tells us this, meaning that we can argue that these gender abnormalities are part of the fall. They're not intended by God. And so they're just like any other disease that is harmful, right? And it's not God's intention. It's part of the sin nature and everything in the world. So we can say that these are abnormalities and it's terrible and it causes suffering, but it doesn't mean that there's no gender binary because God created us male and female. But if you don't believe that actually happened, what have you got?
Yeah, you need the rock. You need the foundation of God's word.
So I get told a lot by people in the apologetics world that, like, this age of the earth thing is like, this is passé. People used to care about this like a long time ago. No one cares about it anymore, and it doesn't really matter because it's not an essential of the gospel. I hear that all the time. That doesn't mean it's not important for other things. It is absolutely incredibly important what you believe about the entire history of the world, the entire history of humankind, and the entire history of God's relationship with mankind. If you believe something different about that, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect what you believe about almost everything. It's going to affect what you believe about yourself, your place in the world, how you are made. And we're seeing a lot of serious consequences of the lack of defending this as the true history of the world. It has consequences.
Yeah, he's got our savior coming from a mythological lineage. And what does he do? Okay, fine. Let's grant maybe for a moment that it's mythological. We see in Chronicles, though, there's another lineage there, and then in the book of Luke. So how does he? Are those just back to the?
So I think, and I might be misremembering, but I think Craig's position on the genealogies is that the people are real and historical. It's just the timeline is not. So I think that's what he believes, is that the people are real people. And so he might say, like, because the genealogies, there's one in Luke and in Matthew, right? That are very close to the Genesis ones. I think he would say those are real people. And so this is the real genealogy of Jesus. But I don't know what he does with the fact that it goes all the way back to Adam.
Yeah.
Hugh Ross claims there's all these breaks or gaps in the genealogy, meaning that 90% is not there. Well, I don't know about you, but if I found a document that was missing 90% of what it was supposed to be about, I would be like, this is not an accurate document.
Or maybe those ages were more than hundreds of years. Maybe they were thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands.
Go the opposite direction, right?
That's right.
He actually says in the book, this was another good part of the book, that he asked all around to all his buddies, his scholarly buddies in theology and biblical studies and all this, and he asked everybody he could think of, what do these numbers mean? And he said, nobody knows.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I know.
Yeah.
Everybody before 1700 knew, right? It's not difficult to see what that meant, but he says no one knows. He even goes over a really crazy, whacked out like interpretation of the numbers and shows how crazy it is, which I've heard before. Like, people bring this up. It's like, well, it's hexadecimal, this, that, and the other thing. And if you add 7 and subtract 2, they're all divisible by 5, except for 2 over here, which we'll just leave those out. They're outliers, they don't work. But the system works,
Well, I see a lot of ancient Near Eastern scholars do the same thing, like Dennis Lamoureux and other scholars from biologos, but they don't realize that there can be truth in both. Forgive me for my voice. And these ages can be real, but with great symbolism in there as well, because we see that all throughout the scripture. It's not like one or the other. Yeah, there could be deeper meaning there. That doesn't negate the fact that the numbers are real.
One commentary I read said, when it was going over Genesis, when it got to the genealogies, it just said like one phrase for every section of Genesis 5 is like, it's saying that these people they just lived a long time. It's like, well, okay.
But then they can't engage the science on it. Why do these ages, in which you're talking about earlier, how the drop in ages from pre-flood to post-flood actually matches, and we've discussed this many times on the channel with many different creation scientists, this perfect biological decay curve.
Yeah.
Because
Dr. Robert Carter has done some work on this, I know, where he matches it to an exponential decay curve.
Right.
And it's like, did the ancient Hebrews know about exponential functions? I don't think so.
Were they experts in mathematics and biology and decay curves to
there's no way
this data?
This is real data. It matches an exponential decay curve, and so there's probably some kind of natural reason. Exponential decay curves are all over nature.
Right.
That's my background, is a hard science degree. You use exponential equations all the time.
Can you unpack that for maybe someone who isn't really familiar with what we're talking about, and how maybe genetic, from the biblical understanding of genetics, would explain that decay curve in the long ages? Is that something that we can give an account for scientifically?
Yeah. So Craig actually, this is one of the things he thinks is palpably false, is the long ages. And also the immortality that Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden. He says that's impossible. People can't live forever. And he says that the fruit in the garden is magical. So they ate it and they just magically live forever. And I responded to this in some depth, actually, because if you look at the science of aging, it's not difficult to understand scientifically how someone could live forever. What's difficult to understand is why we age at all. That's actually the problem. Like, scientifically, we don't actually have a real good explanation for aging. As far as we can tell, our cells are structured so they could just keep going forever, as long as they keep getting energy, right? And everything keeps, when you don't get bashed in the head or whatever, things should continue on forever. The best answer is likely that mutations accumulate over your lifespan. But even there, it's kind of a little weird, because we have two different kinds of cells in our body. We have somatic cells. Soma is the Greek word for body. And we have germline cells, which are stem cells. And somatic cells, it's called the Hayflick limit. If you culture human somatic cells in like a petri dish or something, they can only live to be about 60 days. And so the big question when they discovered this is, well, why do humans last much longer than that? If our cells can only last 60 days, why do humans last forever? Or not forever, but many years. And it turns out that stem cells can last much longer. And part of the reason is somatic cells, when DNA replicates or copies itself, there are these sections of DNA at the end of every chromosome called telomeres. And every time DNA copies itself, a tiny little bit of the telomere gets cut off. And eventually, when you get to too many copies, stuff starts getting cut off that is not the telomere. The telomere is there to protect the rest of the chromosome. But once the telomere gets completely removed, then important stuff starts getting cut off and the cell dies, right? That's the most likely reason for the Hayflick limit, why cells can only live so long. But it turns out in stem cells have a protein called telomerase that extends the telomere. So
Right.
it just keeps extending the telomeres. And so I don't know how relevant this is, but so the question is, why couldn't you have telomerase active in somatic cells? There doesn't seem to be any reason why you couldn't do that. So that's one possible reason for aging, is maybe Adam and Eve were created so that telomerase would be active in somatic cells. It can't be the whole answer. They've actually tried this, right, to activate telomerase, and the result is cancer. You just get cancer when that happens. Well, what is cancer? Cancer is a result of cells that are growing out of control because the control mechanisms that prevent them from doing that are broken, right? And so what we think now is that mutations are probably in general the cause for aging. And so I don't think there's any reason in principle why we couldn't have things like, or why Adam and Eve couldn't have things like DNA repair mechanisms that we know we have these some of the time, but what if Adam and Eve had a whole bunch more of it so that all errors were corrected when they had mutations? As for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of, or the tree of life that they would eat so they could live forever, Craig makes the point, that's a good point, that even after Adam and Eve sinned in Genesis 3, God says that if they remain in the garden, they will eat from the tree of life and live forever. So sin does not cause physical death, right? God was saying that even though they've sinned, they can eat from the tree of life and still live forever. So I have to kick them out of the garden so that they'll die. So what was it about the supposedly magic fruit of the tree of life that kept them living forever? Well, I've speculated that a lot of these mechanisms, biochemical mechanisms that Adam and Eve might have had that are lost now, like extra DNA repair mechanisms, active telomerase in somatic cells. There's all kinds of other things that could have been going on. Some of them might have required what's called in biochemistry cofactors. And those are special molecules that are required for certain things in your cells to function right. And vitamins and minerals are cofactors. So the reason it's important to eat your vitamins is because they're cofactors and they help things work right in your body. And if you're missing certain kinds of vitamins, you will get diseases. So vitamin C is an essential vitamin because we cannot synthesize it. We have to eat it in our diet. And if one thing about pirates, right, is pirates are always portrayed with missing teeth. Well, why is that? It's because in the age of wooden ships and pirates, they didn't know they didn't know about vitamin C. And so if you went to sea without a source of vitamin C and you didn't have vitamin C enough, you would get a disease called scurvy. And one of the symptoms of scurvy is you start losing your teeth. And so regular navies started to require that their ships bring along barrels of apples and make their sailors eat it during the voyage so they get vitamin C. But pirates didn't do that. So you've got, again, so that's an example of if you don't eat the right stuff, specifically a fruit with vitamin C in it, you're going to get a disease and start degenerating. Okay, so my speculation is that the tree of life had a fruit that had very specific concoction of molecules in it that were like essential vitamins and minerals for human beings to live forever. And once God kicked them out of the garden, they didn't have access to it anymore. So they started degenerating.
I think those are some excellent answers. That's really good. Like what you were saying about the telomerase, that you've got active telomerase if you were to have it in somatic cells, which telomerase, from my understanding, prevents senescence, which is cell death, adds new DNA to the cell, prevents the telomeres from shortening, is what you're, because shortening telomeres over time results in aging and death, from my understanding. So yeah, if you were to have And these are all scientific reasons. It makes sense with mutation accumulation, degeneration, wild changes after the flood, that your pre-flood humans, or of course before the fall, you'd have these mechanisms in place, including the DNA repair enzymes that you mentioned, Ben.
Yeah, and because there's so much information in biology, it would be almost impossible to recreate this stuff, because it'd be just too hard to find, because these sequences are so rare. But one thing about the flood also that creationists have worked on is the population bottleneck reduces genetic diversity. So we talked about that in reference to inbreeding before. So if you lose a lot of genetic diversity, it's very plausible that lifespans would decrease dramatically. And so when it was just Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, and they're the only ones who survived the flood, that's a population bottleneck. And Robert Carter has calculated that they would have lost probably about 20% of their genetic diversity in that population bottleneck. And that certainly, almost certainly contributed to the decline in lifespans after the flood.
Well, that's a lot of genes that we wouldn't, I'll say this, Sam, and then go ahead. That's a lot of genes that we would have had in the pre-flood world because of that genetic bottleneck. And so, I mean, if Adam would have had 20 million variants, the flood reduces that in half, let's say 10 million, and a lot of diversity just in general lost. From my understanding today, people using CRISPR or those that are into longevity, we've got a video, and I can't remember all the details of it. Our ministry partner, someone who helps out here, Matt, did it. He's done a lot of study on biblical longevity, where those that are not even creationists or Christians have admitted or recognized that there's certain genes, longevity genes, that you could turn back on, hypothetically, that would result in people living to 1,000. I mean, these are people that don't have any investment in Christian theology, but even they're recognizing that there's certain genes that are broken that if turned back on or fixed, we could live a lot longer than we do today, which I think is amazing.
I think in general, that's probably the case. I suspect most of those genes have probably been deleted by now, because generally if genes are not being used, eventually there'll be a deletion mutation, and because they're not contributing anything, that will just carry on, right? So usually when genes don't get used, they get deleted by deletion mutations.
Good point.
I kind of think that God is preventing us from living longer, but I have kind of maybe theological reasons for believing that, but we could be able to increase human lifespan a little bit. But most scientists I've talked about with this are very skeptical of living longer. I don't think they'll ever be able to do it. Right. But people like Jordan Peterson are into this stuff. It's why he likes lobsters, because lobsters don't die natural deaths. And I think actually lobsters do have telomerase active in all their somatic cells. The only reason lobsters die is because they outgrow their shells and they basically get constricted.
Yeah.
So I think this is the basis of Peterson's fascination with lobsters. And he promotes stuff like taking infusions of NADH, which is a common cofactor, like what I was talking about earlier, in the body, and stuff like that. There are things you can do to increase your health for sure. So I'm not doing that, but
I think there's a certain, and again, don't quote me on this because we did a study on it and put out some videos a year or two ago, but I think there's a certain enzyme that's found in all cells, superoxide dismutase, I think it's called. Matt has spoken on that. And some of these creatures like lobsters actually have a high amount of it, which helps them to live a lot longer, like you're saying. And so there's certain enzymes that we've probably lost in terms of the amount that we have over time since creation and the flood, that going back closer to creation, since we've lost so much, we'd have much more of that to sustain our function and health and longevity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just so many great points on that topic, Ben.
Yeah, I think superoxide dismutase, if I'm not mistaken, gets rid of oxygen radicals, which are damaging to your cells. Don't quote me on that. I don't have my biochemistry books in front of me, but that's what it sounds like. Oxygen radicals are damaging to cells, and that sounds like it would be an enzyme that takes care of oxygen radicals or something.
Yeah. So if you have some of these creatures like lobsters that have much more of this than we do as humans, then a lot of those free radicals, harmful things building up in systems, you have a lot of those enzymes to get rid of it and sustain longevity. So
one interesting thing from biochemistry is we can synthesize vitamin D, and we do it when sunlight hits our skin.
right.
So there's a certain wavelength of UV light from the sun that our body takes advantage of the energy of it and uses it to make vitamin D. Well, it turns out that this wavelength of UV light also causes DNA mutations of a very specific kind. And our body also has a DNA repair mechanism for those specific kinds of mutations.
Wow.
So I think this is evidence that God designed us this way, that yes, we're going to get this UV light that we can make vitamin D with, but it's going to cause mutations. But we have the fix for that, right? And I think part of the degeneration and reduced lifespans is probably we just started losing some of these mechanisms that God originally designed for us that prevent those kinds of degeneration effects, like prevents mutations or fixes mutations. We just don't have all those anymore.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, I think those are some great points. And so what I'd like to do, gentlemen, actually, before we do, I'll ask you, Ben, and I'm looking at my notes. I'm also looking at your comprehensive review that I want to recommend people check out. Maybe one of our mods can put it in the chat again on creation.com, your review of In Quest for the Historical Atom. And so we've touched on the mytho-history argument, the genre switch. We've discussed the historical atom, and also how William Lane Craig ignores 2 Peter 3. And so I'm wondering if there's anything else you wanted to add in terms of the theology. I would like to engage before we wrap things up a little bit, his science arguments that he goes over in his book. And so is there anything you wanted to add? And before you do, a question that's been on my mind, one of those traits or characteristics that Craig looks to define if something's myth or not, is one of those being deities. I think I remember reading that or hearing that in a lecture, where if it's fantastical in terms of its deities, but that's kind of mind-boggling, because obviously the Bible in Genesis describes God, his supernatural creation, Jesus is deity, the deity of Christ. And so would that even be a good determining factor? Ben, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think one of the 6 criteria or family resemblances that I mentioned as being trivial, I think one of them is it's about deities.
Right.
So again, like you said, that just applies to the whole Bible. It doesn't tell us whether it's historical or true or not.
Mm-hmm.
Just because something's about a deity doesn't mean it's false. And I think Craig would agree with that. But it's an argument he makes to use to put it in this genre of literature that he wants to try and then leverage to say it's not history. It's like, you can apply that to the whole Bible, man. Like, I don't see why we should take that super seriously. So I kind of discounted all those criteria. But
yeah, and I see that as the problem. The unbeliever just moves that line all the way to the end of the Bible. And I think
I really think, like when we said at the very beginning, is like Craig kind of he jumped into this, right, without knowing a lot of this argument before. And so he lacked a lot of the guardrails that experienced people in this debate have. So don't say that, because that'll be the slippery slope argument that we won't be able to defend the rest of the Bible, like you're saying. But he jumped into it, and he makes all these arguments, and it comes out looking an awful lot like the history of the last 250 years of Western civilization, where people started down this path of saying, well, we think that the Earth is actually older in the 1750s, and then eventually you get to liberal theology where they're denying all miracles, right? And then you get to evolution and all the rest, where you start wondering, well, what's the difference between human beings and animals anyway? And you see in Craig's thinking where this all started, I think.
Right.
I said in the review, like, he's basically retracing the last couple hundred years of Western history. And he doesn't know to stay away from the pitfalls. So you see like the beginning of it. Like, this is the interpretation of the Bible that started causing all this liberal theology and falling away from Christianity, because we thought, well, we can't deny science because it's literally what we're just seeing in the world, right? Which is not the case. But it's like, well, it looks old, so it must be old, so we can't believe the Bible anymore. And that's I think that's why I care about this so much. I think it's where it all started, man. It's
Yeah.
the fall of Christendom.
Right. I think that's why it is such an important topic. And it is very important that we do what we're doing tonight, and we offer a comprehensive examination or analysis of William Lane Craig's arguments here. And so, to land the plane on the theology aspects of his book and his arguments, is there anything that you wanted to add into what we've been talking about for the first couple hours, Ben, largely on the theology and his claims of mytho-history?
I think the maybe one thing I didn't mention that's in the review is the whole claim that mytho-history is actually a real genre of literature, I think, is questionable. Because the only thing Craig seems to base it on is this scholar named Torkild Jakobsen. I think that's how you say his name. Who studied this ancient Sumerian myth which he calls the Eridu Genesis. But the thing is the Eridu Genesis is like this scholar literally just pieced it together from 3 different texts, and then said this is a coherent myth. And one part of the text looks historical and another part doesn't, or whatever. I'm not versed in that. But then he says this text that he literally constructed himself from ancient documents, according to how he thought it worked, right? They weren't found together or anything. And he just says, well, this is this sort of mythical story that also has this historical interest. And then Craig just takes that and says, well, I'm going to put just Genesis 1 through 11 in that genre. But he doesn't give other examples of any other texts that are actually in this supposed genre. That it's just this constructed text that this one guy made up. Well, not, he didn't make it up, but he concocted it from different ancient texts and put them together. And then Genesis 1 through 11, which is cut off from the rest of Genesis, again, by modern scholars. So I actually just question whether it is such a genre of mytho-history. I think in the book, he says something about myth that is really telling about where he's coming from. Is like, I think this quote, I love it. I love this quote because I think that this is the real thesis of his book. Is he says, when reality in the world comes into conflict with the myth, it is the myth that must and does change. Okay? So if he thinks that Genesis is myth, and when that myth comes into conflict with reality, which he says we get from science, modern science tells us what is really true, and the myth comes into conflict with it, it's always the myth that has to change. It's always the Bible that must change to match reality, right? So at what point does that myth have any authority at all?
So the naturalist gets to define reality for me?
Science.
Or the anti-theist? Yeah,
Science
it would be a naturalistic understanding of the physical world. Yeah.
Man, that's awesome. I appreciate how thorough that was. So basically, you suspect that this whole idea of mytho-history is a made-up genre with no real validity.
Yeah, as an actual separate genre. Myth is not made-up genre. And even in the book, like, Craig gives ancient Greek myths as an example of what he's talking about, like myths. And then he sort of implies that that ancient Greek myths belong in this genre of mytho-history. But elsewhere in the book, he just calls them regular myths. So he doesn't call them mytho-history. So I don't think he's really holding to a clear distinction between a myth and a mytho-history.
Right.
So I think for him, really, they're the same thing. He just doesn't want to say it's a myth without saying it's historical, because that sounds bad or something. I don't know. I just question the whole language of mytho-history. It sounds like he's just talking about myths. So he thinks it belongs in the genre of myth.
Yeah, Iron Matt says it's a myth about a non-myth. to have.
There you go. That's it.
Well, I think he did a fantastic job at addressing the theology there, the error, and that's what we need. We need a comprehensive examination of these arguments to uphold the truth of biblical creation and young earth creation. I'd like to spend a few minutes here just to leave no stone unturned and get your guys' thoughts on what he has to say here in regards to, and these are the scientific arguments he uses in his book, if memory serves me correct. Homology, pseudogenes, I think, are the two big ones he uses, and the universality of the genetic code. And so just from his own mouth here, and then maybe we can give some commentary just to leave no stone unturned on this issue. Ben, you having read his book on the historical atom, how much time does he devote to the science aspect of the creation evolution debate?
Almost zero.
Okay.
The point of the book is he doesn't talk much about evolution. He kind of assumes it, but he doesn't defend evolution in the book. What he's mainly doing is arguing that, I mean, he does in isolated cases, but mainly he's arguing that all these other human populations are really human.
Okay.
And I mean, it's been a long time since I read that part of the book, so
he's making his case basically for Adam and Eve being Homo heidelbergensis and why.
Yeah, that's what he's doing in the book. So it's not a real, like, rigorous defense of evolutionary theory or anything like that. Craig actually, Craig's position is that he says he's not a theistic evolutionist for scientific reasons. Okay, so he has scientific objections to theistic evolution, and they would, I think, run along the lines of an intelligent design type objection. But he wants to claim that intelligent design isn't science. So I think,
yeah, because I've heard him recently in an interview on Capturing Christianity. He was questioning the validity of universal common descent, that everything's related. And so he might have separate ancestries if you go back far enough in time. But he does speak pretty strongly for human evolution, humans and chimpanzees being related through common ancestry. So he at least from what I can understand of what he's saying, he's pretty adamant on that, but then he might question how far back you can go in terms of common ancestry. At least that's maybe he's changing his mind on a few things. I don't know, because
I don't actually know what he believes about universal common ancestry. His model is consistent with universal common ancestry. As for human evolution, so like 7 million years ago, we split off from chimps. Right. He does make some arguments about that, where he says there's mistakes or non-functional mistakes that are the same in both lineages, so that's evidence that this mistake occurred before the split, that kind of thing. You're really well versed in that sort of argument, I know. So
yeah, he lays out he lays out one here on homology that I think is interesting, the way he lays it out. I'll play it. It's just very short, and then let's get your thoughts on it, because I do find it interesting that I don't remember if he engages our best counters to it, though, which, is what I like to do. Is if I'm engaging an evolutionist talking point, I like to provide their best case and then describe why that doesn't work, right? Kind of represent the other side and the best they have to offer. But let's just briefly listen to what William Lane Craig says here, and then we'll comment.
Furthermore, the DNA of two different organisms tends to be similar if those organisms are anatomically similar. So let's pick these one at a time, Bill, beginning with that one.
Okay. First of all, in laying out 3 evidences for common descent, which is what he's talking about here, he really doesn't survey most of the evidence. This is another evolutionary textbook, Evolution by Fatoyma and Kirkpatrick. And in this volume, they lay out 7 different lines of independent evidence in support of the thesis of common ancestry. And so he's dealing only with 3 of these, not even most of the evidence that is adduced on behalf of it. Now, the first piece of evidence that he deals with is the similarities in anatomy and in their genetic makeup. So let's talk about those a little bit. These are called homologs. That is to say, you have similar structures or similar genetic sequences of DNA in different organisms, which suggests that those organisms are descended from a common ancestor. A good example of the structural homologs would be the so-called pentadactyl limb. That is to say, the limb of tetrapods, 4-limbed animals, that terminates in a 5-fingered hand. And this skeletal structure is common in humans, in seals with flippers, in lizards and mammals of various sorts, bats, even. So this pentadactyl limb is consistent across a wide variety of animals. And the suggestion is that this shows that they evolved from a common ancestor. Okay,
let's stop it there. So an argument from homology, the similarities in structure, he briefly mentioned genetics. In the biological world, he looked to the forelimb of tetrapods, the limb that comes into your hand, your phalanges, across the biological world, basically mammals, whales, bats, humans, so on and so forth. And so these similarities in structure in the biological world, do those similarities only point to common descent? Like, is that a differentiating line of evidence for common descent, which he is arguing for? Ben, Sam, what do you guys think about that?
I mean, obviously there's another explanation that they could be common design.
Right.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to differentiate between those 2 explanations. I know biochemically, this argument from homology is really difficult to make because there are lots of examples of proteins that have the same structure but very different sequences.
Right.
And so it's the sequence that is claimed to evolve by Darwinian mechanism, where you have successive mutations, right? But if you have very similar structures with completely different sequences, that basically blows up the whole argument from morphology, even at the protein level, because what really matters is the mutations, the sequences of mutations that can go from a common ancestor to the diverse groups that exist today. So I don't put a lot of stock in these morphological arguments. This sounds really 19th century to me. Like this is like all they could do back then. Well, we're looking at this thing with our little magnifying glass that's like 10x or whatever, and it's like, well, hey, they've got 5 fingers. Look at that. Right. Like,
well, and they want to have their cake and eat it too, because okay, these similar structures that have maybe modified a bit, right? That's where they get their descent with modification. They go back to a common ancestor, but then you got similar structures that they would argue don't go back to a common ancestor because the difference is like, and then they look to homoplasy or convergent evolution. Yeah. So when it's inconvenient to them, but it's still evidence for evolution, the differences. So I think with the eyeball, the sophisticated eye system, they're now forced to conclude that the eye has evolved independently like 20 or 25 times.
Yikes.
I think it's actually 40.
40 times.
I remember right. But yeah, so the whole so what you said there was there are things that look the same but are not produced by common ancestry. The evolutionists have a word for that. It's called analogs.
Yeah, right. So it's not a homolog, it's analog, right?
There's homologs versus analogs. And originally, when evolution was first proposed, homology was an argument in favor of evolution because, look, there's these similar structures. But now what they've found is you can't really make this distinction without defining it.
Yeah.
As due to common ancestry or not due to common ancestry, which means if you use homology as an argument for evolution today, it's circular reasoning because homology today is defined as structures that look the same and the similarity is due to common descent. Is that evidence for common descent? No, that's just a definition.
Right. Yeah.
Because now they know that there's all these structures that do look the same, but mess up their evolutionary trees because so they have to say that, well, they look the same, but they're not due to common descent because these two organisms aren't related in
They're
that
due
way.
to convergent evolution.
Convergent
They've evolved
evolution,
independently.
yeah. So
I think they have to do that with the echolocation systems, if I remember correctly, of bats and dolphins and whales.
they have to do that with all kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
And, like,
right. We could spend all day.
for me, like, I like to engage at the more biochemical level at sequence analysis, like phylogenetic trees. Those things are so messed up. There is no consensus on a phylogenetic tree that fits the data because it's just all completely intertwined. We've got nowadays, when you sequence a new organism that hasn't been genetically sequenced before, you can just bet that like something like 30% of their genes are orphan genes, which means they have no homologs in any other species and or group or whatever it is. And in protein science, homologs in terms of proteins are defined as 30 to 40% sequence identity, which is really low when you think about it. Because like you'd expect something like 5% for protein sequences would be the same anyway, just by random chance.
Mm-hmm.
And in DNA, it's like 25%. So because there's only 4 characters, and proteins there's 20. So sequence identity is supposed to be 30 to 40% sequence identity. So how many mutations does it take to get from one homolog to another homolog? And there's evolutionists who have tried to do experiments to show that you can get from one protein to another by an evolutionary process. And they ended up concluding that, in science, when you don't get the results you want, sometimes you don't publish them. And so you try to make do with what you can publish. And then scientists who read it will read between the lines, right? So I can't even remember this guy's name. He was working at Oregon University, and Michael Behe commented a ton on his work years ago. But he was trying to do this with a couple of hormone receptors. And so which are proteins that grab onto hormones and cause a signal cascade to occur in your cells so it's like hormones are signaling molecules. They send messages between cells, right? So he's working on this hormone receptor, and he hypothesized an ancestral hormone receptor for 2 modern ones, and was trying to show how he was trying to find the exact mutational pathway, right, that led back to this ancestral protein. And his conclusion that he published was, you can't evolve backwards. And it's sort of like left the question hanging. Well, can you evolve forwards then?
Right. Yeah. Well, of course, because evolution happened. We assume evolution in all our conclusions.
Right. And people who, that an evolutionist has given up on that kind of research when they start talking about pre-adaptation.
Yeah, right.
Where they say, well, this specific interval that we studied, it doesn't work. So the adaptation that is there now in modern stuff must have been there before.
Mm-hmm, right.
So it was pre-adapted because they can't explain it and they can't show that it evolved.
Well, you mentioned orphan genes, which I love to discuss as well. Amazing evidence for special creation. They lack any real consistent hierarchy because there's no evidence for their ancestor genes. They kind of just pop up. They're taxonomically restricted. And so what are your thoughts on their, what I like to call rescue devices of de novo gene synthesis and gene duplication? To me, it's circular. So, because to the evolutionists, why do orphan genes exist? Well, because of de novo gene synthesis. It popped up in the non-coding region of the genome at some point through mutation. Well, why does de novo gene synthesis exist? Why is that something that happens? Well, because we got these orphan genes. So it's just this circle. They're trying to explain the orphan genes with something made up. And they made that up because there's orphan genes, Ben.
Well, like gene duplication isn't really de novo, right? Like it's coming from a copy of another gene. So I guess I would have to look at what each person means by de novo. But yeah, gene duplication is the idea that when a gene duplicates, let's say the organism needs it to survive. And so the question that we would pose to them is, well, how can the gene mutate through all these non-functional intermediates till it gets to the new gene that actually does something? Because there's many mutations that have to happen. And so the evolutionist comes back and says, well, there was a gene duplication event, and one copy of the gene kept working and didn't mutate, somehow. Right. And then the other copy of the gene was free to mutate in the population because the first copy is still performing the old function that it needs. And now the new copy is free to do whatever it wants. It's going to neutrally mutate through the sequence space to hit on this this new sequence. I think all those kinds of arguments just fail to the when you really understand the size of the sequence space and what intelligent design theorists call the probabilistic resources of the system. So if you just do simple math, I think that when the one I know is Doug Axe's research on a protein called beta lactamase, specifically called TIM1 in biochemistry circles, but it's a typical experiment I did as an undergrad, where you have a drug called ampicillin. I think this is ampicillin, that beta lactamase will metabolize, meaning it will destroy it. And so if a bacteria has beta lactamase, it can live in the presence of ampicillin, which normally kills it, right? So so this protein, Axe studied a part of the protein that was 150 amino acids long. And if there's 20 amino acids, right, and there's 153 positions, the total number of possible combinations is 20 to the 153rd power, which is 10 to the 195th power. I memorized all these numbers like years ago. Compare that to the total number of atoms in the universe, which is like 10 to the 65th, and the mass of the universe, I think, is something like 10 to the 80th. I mean, this is more. When you say astronomical, that doesn't cover it. Okay, this is a huge number, and there's no possible way that physical or biological populations were able to mutate fast enough with enough copies to search out all the possible pathways to get from one protein to another. And so if you really understand that, you have to believe that everything just got lucky.
Right.
Like really lucky.
Yeah,
And
that's one of the arguments that actually Anthony Flew listed as one of the reasons that brought him out of atheism. He was a very prominent atheist. So for any unbelievers out there, yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic argument. I suppose Craig would point to the mind of God, but that would be guiding the process, okay? I guess if we're going to represent what he believes. But see, even that would be inconsistent, because the prevailing consensus is that these processes happen independent from any supernatural or divine intervention.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that opens up a whole nother can of worms. Is what does Craig believe about God's guidance of the evolutionary process?
Yeah.
So to my knowledge, Craig seems to accept the argument that I just sort of started on there. He seems to accept that argument from information, that this is an insurmountable barrier to a naturalistic account of evolution. But this is one of the things I think his views are potentially evolving on. In the book, he argued, like what we said earlier, for that God can intervene and cause mutations. That's sort of what I would call a progressive creation view, where God intervenes and causes mutations by just moving the particles, right, as they say, right, intervening in the natural world. But Craig has this other view that he suggested that I think he is more partial to, which again, I think is because of his theological positions, not so much anything else. And it appeals to a view that's very popular with theologians today called Molinism. And so he will say, according to this view, he could accept that evolution is a probabilistic process. In other words, it's random somehow, even potentially ontologically random, meaning literally uncaused events in the natural world. But Molinism suggests, in the case of free will versus divine sovereignty, that free will can be indeterminate and God is still sovereign because God has this thing called middle knowledge. So you probably heard of that, but he wants to apply this argument to evolution and creation. So in theology, the argument is that God can be sovereign where he chooses from among what's called feasible worlds on Molinism, meaning these are the worlds that creatures with free will make all their choices, right, based on their circumstances, and God knows what all those options are, and he chooses which one to create. And that means he chooses the world that actually exists. And he chooses the world where he knows and has chosen this world where everything exactly occurs. And Craig says this, it's down to every movement of every subatomic particle in the universe, right? So God chose that. But it could still be the case that human free will is indeterminate because God chose from among these worlds which one to create, but he chose the one where he knew what we would choose. So when you apply this to the evolution stuff, evolution is sort of like us with free will, where it's indeterminate. It has all these random mutations, right? And God is the same thing. He's God, but he creates the world. So he chooses from among these feasible worlds, and he knows what evolution is going to do in the world that he chose, but it's still indeterminate somehow.
I think there's and again, I get that I could probably be wrong myself, but I think there's an error there, because it's one thing to say that that God's creatures have free will, but not if it's going to override God's will. And here's what I mean by that. If evolution is ontologically random, well, then what about God's plan for mankind? If it's ontologically random and perhaps it doesn't create mankind, then you've got a problem there. But I suppose if you point back to where God, realized this and chose the world where it works, then I don't know. These conversations, they can make your head hurt. They can.
Yeah, Molinism is really difficult to understand. I'm not a Molinist, but it is a popular view nowadays. In general, what you're saying, I agree with. It's that evolution. If evolution created us, the model of evolution is random. Okay, so regardless of what you believe actually happened, and if you'll talk to scientists who believe different things, like they'll say, well, it's not really random, it's actually deterministic. Like all the laws apply and force things to go down a certain path, like a ball rolling down a hill, right? But it doesn't matter because the theory depends on probabilities. Okay, and so it says the mutations have a probability, right, of less than 1, which means they're not certain to occur on the model of evolution. So if you're saying that evolution is the way we were created, that includes the understanding of mutations as probabilistic. And that means that, in my view, that God cannot use evolution to create because it means that it could have done something that God didn't want it to do.
Right.
And so it wouldn't lead to the result. It wouldn't necessarily lead to the result that he wanted.
Correct.
So
And
that
that's
makes him no longer the creator. That makes him a spectator, where
right.
he starts the ball rolling and it ends up where we are today. And God's like, oh, wow, look at that.
You got lucky.
Yeah, it means he's not really the creator.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you can take a realist view of evolutionary theory and accept that God is the creator. You have to have some other view that, well, it's not really random. It's just the model that's random or something like that, right? Or some kind of Molinist view, which I have other issues with. But my point is I'm working on an article on this right now, actually, which I'm behind on. So, but my argument is that regardless of what your rescue device is theologically, it is always the case, and you cannot deny that if evolution, as it exists in the literature, as it exists in science, what evolutionary biologists mean when they say evolutionary theory, if that is true, if that is how we came to be, that is incompatible with the Christian doctrine of creation.
I agree.
Because it means that God was either lucky and he just got what he wanted by happenstance. That's not the doctrine of creation. The doctrine of creation says God made us intentionally. He intended to get us out of this, right? At the very least, even Christians who don't believe Genesis is history believe that, right? This is an essential doctrine of Christianity. It's not like the age of the earth debate. The doctrine of creation is essential. If you don't believe God is the creator, you're not a Christian.
Right.
So he would have to be affirming a doppelganger model, not the prevailing model.
What does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Like it looks the same, but there's no relationship between the two.
Okay. Something like
Yeah, they look identical. They look like twins, but there's no relationship.
Like you can't tell the difference, right? Yeah.
So, because it would have to be some sort of divine guidance, which is not the secular model.
Right.
Everything else is the same kind of
divine guidance that you can't empirically tell the difference.
Yeah, that you're trying to deny, which is weird because now you're challenging God's omniscience. Because there's all of these things that God doesn't know. I think it gets messy, and I'm just going to trust that the wisdom of God is higher than the wisdom of man, and I'm just going to believe that what God revealed to us is true. I'm just going to roll with that.
Well, you see, I think William Lane Craig put out a video titled "Is Evolution Anti-Christian?" And you've seen many theistic evolutionists engage in debates. Can evolution fit within the Bible, or is evolution compatible with the Bible? But what you're pointing out, Ben, is that no, evolution is not compatible with the Bible, and evolution is anti-Christian.
It's not even compatible with basic Christian theology,
right?
Much less the Bible. So if you want to believe evolution created us, you have, and the doctrine of creation, you have to come up with some deterministic theory of evolution, which is not the theory that's on offer today. It's not what evolutionary biology teaches.
Why try to ruin a perfectly good book, the Bible, with a quote unquote theory like evolution that's been dismantled? We'll have to do a follow-up show at some point, Ben, on just evolution, because you got some good points, brother. I could listen to you forever on that. So I do want to respect your time. We did just hit the 2.5 hour mark. We got one more question to get through here, brother. And it's been an excellent show. It's been great. I wanted a comprehensive show on the issue, and that's what we got. So this comes from Pseudonym, $10 soup chat. Appreciate the support. When Cain, C-A-I-N, Cain and Abel, was marked for others not to kill him, were these others willing to kill Cain unless marked? Well, I got to reread this so I can understand. When Cain was marked for others not to kill him, okay, were these others willing to kill Cain unless marked, while children of Adam, or if willing to kill Canaanites, yet obey the mark? Is there anything you want You got any thoughts on that, Ben?
Not really. I guess the question is like, was it okay for people to kill other people if they weren't marked? I think
Yeah,
is
were
what
they
he's trying
willing
to
to
say.
kill him if he wasn't marked?
I mean, I guess the reason Cain was afraid that someone would kill him is because he killed his brother. So right, like, so the only reason Cain was afraid of being killed is because he was himself a murderer. So my suspicion is that people didn't just go around killing people for being murderers when they weren't. So if you weren't a murderer, you didn't need a mark to protect yourself. So I don't know.
That sounds good.
Really
And just to let you know, the questioner, he it's kind of like an inside thing. When he sends questions, he'll send them in riddles, and so it makes us more fun for us to interpret. But isn't it funny how
question?
isn't it funny how your old earthers or theistic evolutionists, they'll use the argument about Cain to basically say that, well, there must have been other people then on the globe, not just Adam, right?
Yeah, Swamidas says that. I was like, well, who did Cain marry?
Yeah, right.
He married.
Or he went to his
sister,
city,
man.
so there must have already been people there, and so people were created outside the garden. And that's where I think Joshua Swamidas, I don't want to misrepresent him, but I think he says the possibility is there that Adam and Eve were created de novo within a greater population of hominins at the time.
Yeah. So he takes what's called the sequential view of Genesis 1 and 2. So he thinks that the human beings who are created in Genesis 1 are not Adam and Eve. Okay, so Genesis 2, he thinks occurs well after Genesis 1 chronologically. So God creates human beings in Genesis 1, and then later on in Genesis 2, he creates Adam and Eve separately from this earlier population of humans. And then they interbreed with this earlier population to the extent where he says it's probably the case that we have no remaining DNA from Adam and Eve. But we're genealogically descended from them in the sense that, if we worked out our entire genealogy all the way back, it would go back somewhere, it would hit on Adam and Eve. And he says that by the year AD 1, so the year after, like whenever Jesus was born, the year 81, every human being, or every biologically human being on Earth, would be genealogically descended from Adam and Eve, and that makes us all persons theologically, is what he says. And
Gets
so the question
confusing.
is, what? Yeah,
Gets
so the
a little
question
confusing.
before that point, whenever it is, were there biological humans who were not theologically human?
Yeah, so he's saying that it would be like a progressive dying off of non-humans up into the point of the first year of Christ, to which all the non-humans would have now been died off, and it was only humans repopulated now at this point. Is that what he's trying to say?
Not that they died off, but that they interbred.
Okay.
To the point where they interbred so much that every remaining human being in existence was somehow related to Adam and Eve.
So all your non-human hominins,
yeah,
and your human hominids interbred to the point where now there's enough genetics in common where they're all human. I'd like to know where that breaking point is.
He makes a distinction between genetic ancestry and genealogical ancestry.
Yeah.
So for him, genetics doesn't matter to the theological claim of being human, right? Only genealogies matter for the theological point. And the reason he does this is because he wants to clear the field. He wants to clear the Bible out of the way, so his scientific models can work exactly the way that they work in mainstream literature under an evolutionary paradigm.
Right.
And that is that we can just talk about the human population genetically as though it never went through a 2-person bottleneck. It was always this population all the way back to when we were chimps or whatever, or the common ancestor, right? So that way he can do his models and then still claim that Adam and Eve were created and introduced into that population. And so theologically, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. So he thinks that's a theological point about we're humans according to the Bible. But we don't have any of we probably don't have any of their DNA. That all comes from this pre-Adamite human population.
The greater population of 30,000 or whatever he wants to hold to.
You know, there's a fun fact that the Guinness Book of World Records from a single man and his wife, 69 children, and that's in recent times. So Adam and Eve, who did Cain and Abel marry? Well, if in recent times, on a short timeline, relatively short timeline, you can give an account of 69 children. Yeah, there's plenty to choose from.
More than enough.
Oh yeah. So I've actually found an illustration of this. If you look up Genghis Khan, there is an estimate that of the population of humans today, about 5% of them are descended from Genghis Khan.
Yeah, that's great.
And that, if you do the math, that's about 400 million people.
Wow.
Or something like 300 to 400 million people. And Genghis Khan is from the 1200s. So he'd be about 800 years old today.
Yeah.
So if he only lived a short life, right? Okay. But if he produced offspring or genetic or genealogical offspring to the tune of 300 to 400 million people, and he didn't even live past, whatever he was, like 80 or something. But he also lived that entire 800 years. How many people could he have fathered then?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's not a strong argument that and then they're the ones that get to give these convoluted explanations and try and say, well, like, and I know William Lane Craig, I think you mentioned this, Ben, in your article, he doesn't take the view that Genesis 2 is a continuation of the story. He would concede that Genesis 1 and 2 are basically recounts. As creationists, we looked at Genesis 2 as basically focusing in now on day 6 and the events associated with Adam and Eve. And William Lane Craig more or less agrees with that, or?
Yeah, he thinks he disagrees with Swaminatha's view.
Yeah.
So he would say they're the same. They're an account of the same story, but he tries to make these arguments that you've all heard before, that there's inconsistencies between Genesis 1 and 2.
Right.
This is a point I made in my podcast. In the Sunday school class, Craig tried to argue and did argue that the inconsistencies between Genesis 1 and 2 are evidence that these are separate creation accounts. And so when you remember what I said about plasticity and flexibility of myths, that if there are different versions of the same myth, that's plasticity that exists at the same time, that's evidence they didn't believe this was historical. In the class, he tried to argue that the inconsistencies between Genesis 1 and 2 show that those are two separate accounts, creation accounts. And therefore, you can argue that the Genesis creation story is plastic because they had these inconsistent, different versions of the myth. But what was really interesting when I read the book is he backed off of that argument almost completely. So he did not argue that that plasticity applies to Genesis because of this. He left in some of the arguments about inconsistencies. And he made this sort of convoluted argument about, I can't remember how it goes now, but he left in the arguments about the inconsistencies, but he strangely backed off the claim that this is evidence of plasticity. So I noticed that.
Yeah.
Or at least he didn't make that argument. So my suspicion is that he talked to somebody or something and realized it wasn't a good argument. So, What was that? He didn't. Why doesn't he argue the same way that?
Yeah, because I was thinking this too. Okay, so why
Oh.
doesn't he argue the same way for the four? Because we know that a lot in the secular camp, they like to argue that the four gospels have inconsistencies and contradictions, so they can't be true.
Craig does mention the Gospels in the book. He gets a lot of mileage out of the genre analysis of the Gospels as ancient biography, which he thinks is very scholarly and is in the literature. I'm sure that's true. That the Gospels were determined to be in the genre of ancient biography. And that means they're historical. So I don't know his specific positions on all the supposed contradictions in the Gospels. My suspicion is he would just take a typical apologist view on that and explain how they're not really contradictions.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's where the consistency comes in.
Yeah.
So if he's going to be consistent, then his arguments for why the Gospels, because we would all agree there's no contradictions or inconsistencies there. So for him to say there are in Genesis 1 and 2, to be consistent, he'd have to use the same approach with the Gospels. But Ben, I got to say, this was an excellent program, and I'm glad we were able to touch on the theology and also the science to an extent, and your article on the topic. Again, I want to recommend people check it out. I made a lot of notes. I dug deep on this the past little while to prepare, and we touched on basically everything that we wanted to. We wanted to keep this comprehensive and leave no stone unturned. So Ben, let me hand it to you, brother. Appreciate your time. I know you're busy. You mentioned you're working on a upcoming article. Excited for that. And so let's leave it to you. If you had any final words, final thoughts you wanted to leave us with, brother.
One of the reasons that old earthers hey, Christopher. Yeah, I've been on his show before.
Yeah, me too.
It's a friend.
Christopher, good to see you, brother. Shout out to Dr. Christopher J. Cernike's channel, Christ Jesus Ministries. Lots. Yeah, actually, you've done a couple interviews there.
I actually have my golden jacket. I have 5 now on his
show. You got your golden jacket. And was one of them on the historical Adam with William Lane Craig?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's an important topic.
Yeah. So, yeah. So let's see. One of the things when I talk to old earthers, I've been doing this a long time. Almost all of them will admit, that one of the main reasons they hold their view is because they think it's more appealing to non-believers.
Right.
Or to waffling Christians, for example. And so they say that's a reason for why we should hold this view and not make, as Craig says, not make the age of the earth a stumbling block or something like that, like it's bad that God told us how things happen. So, and I find that really oddly uncompelling. And Craig himself complains about how evangelicals don't engage in intellectual circles as much as they should. He talks about how evangelicals don't get Nobel Prizes, and he thinks there's an anti-intellectual strain within evangelicalism, and he ties that to young earth creationism. I think is that he thinks that's part of it. And I just would push back on that and say, one of the marks of an intellectual is that intellectuals are supposed to care more about truth than being popular.
Amen.
We are supposed to care more about what is true rigorously and in a scholarly way than what is persuasive to the masses or whoever, pick whoever you're talking about. Our goal should not be to pick our views based on what is persuasive. Our goal should be to pick our views based on what we think is true. The real anti-intellectual is the person who says, well, I'm going to believe all these different things because it's the best way to persuade someone to this other thing. And I just have to wonder, if I was an atheist looking at that, or a waffling believer and looking at that approach and saying to myself, I don't care about that. I care about what is true. And I guess I might be plugging your channel a little bit here, because I notice, right, that young earthers always emphasize the truth. You're called standing for truth. We care about what is true. And in my opinion, that should be the driving factor for intellectual activity and scholarship, is the truth. We care about the truth. Now, we can disagree about the truth. That's fine. But don't tell us that we should take a different view that we don't think is true because it's
Right.
more persuasive to anyone. So that's kind of my final thought on that sort of thing.
I've found in my personal life, personal interactions, yes, we engage a lot of your most militant evolutionists and atheists online. They're very invested in believing in common descent. When I talk to just people in my daily life, okay, when I start describing to them what evolution means, that all life, including them as a human and banana plants, are related through common ancestry, they find that to be not persuasive. So if you're a theistic evolutionist and you think, well, let's just hold evolution, let's push evolution because it's going to be more persuasive to an unbeliever, that's not even necessarily the case. Not universal common descent, that's for sure. And so, but I think you nailed it. Yeah, we're not going to compromise the truth. We're not going to compromise on the truth and what the Bible says for a really bad theory like evolution and an old earth, which we could probably spend another 3 hours, Ben, talking about the evidence against an old earth. So that's why what you're doing here, brother, and your review and your analysis of William Lane Craig is very important. So I appreciate your work and engagement on the topic.
Yeah,
Sam,
thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Sam, appreciate you joining as well, brother. I know you're very interested in these topics and countering compromise, because that's what it is. Theistic evolution. And Ben, you mentioned day age creation, progressive creationism, these new positions. I'm glad we touched on that church history on the issue. Sam, saying it to you, brother. Appreciate you doing this. And do you have any final words, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the Bible says a lot about wisdom and the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of man and wisdom, a philosophy that is independent from God. So if those are the scholarly circles that we're talking about here, I'm fine where I'm at. And, I talk with an awful lot of unbelievers and atheists, and they don't hold the old earthers or the theistic evolutionists in a high regard because even they understand the truth. They reject the truth, and the Bible talks a lot about that in Romans 1, but they're not confused on what the Bible teaches. And so, yeah, Ben, it's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed this stream. Donny, thank you so much for having me on. It's truly been a pleasure. And yeah, God bless you guys and everyone in chat. Thanks again.
And those atheists you like to talk to, they love you, don't they, Sam?
They're trying. It's a love-hate relationship. Right. I love them. They hate me. But we're trying to figure it out.
You're just trying to give them the truth. He that winneth souls is wise. You're just trying to get them into the kingdom.
At the end of the day,
all out of love.
Yeah. Amen.
Okay. Well, Ben, God bless you. Sam, God bless you as well. To the chat, thank you so much for tuning in. God bless you guys. You guys are awesome. Appreciate the questions, the interaction. Appreciate the engagement, and please do check the description box of this video for the relevant links, specifically a link to Ben's article reviewing William Lane Craig's book here. So hopefully we left no stone unturned and put this topic of theistic evolutionism to bed. Ben, hopefully we can have you on again in the future, maybe focus on the age of the earth, something like that. And it's okay. Thank you for joining, and to the audience, thank you for tuning in. Standing for Truth is out.